Hi, good afternoon and welcome to this third instalment of our KQ Conference 2021 Triptych Building Back Together. I want to start by thanking our fantastic and generous sponsors, British Land, without whom we couldn't have put this great programme together. We have had a couple of fantastic days filled with discussion and debate, and we have a great day afternoon ahead of us. Over the last 2 days, we've discussed and debated two themes, working together and learning together. Our third strand of our overarching theme, building back together, is working together. We've yet to fully understand the profound and far-reaching impacts of the pandemic. We do know that the existing issues and divisions that have been magnified and increased, including the economic and digital divides. For instance, we've seen a 7.5% drop in pupil numbers across London due to people leaving the city, we believe, and maybe a bit of Brexit thrown in there as well. We do know that many businesses are rethinking what working looks like for their employees, with many employers moving to previously unheard of levels of flexibility. And I was reading this morning a report from research in Iceland that some businesses are serious. It was looking at a potential of a 4-day week. This idea that people working from home, working in a much more efficient way, and actually you get the same amount of work for a fewer days. So let's see if that one takes hold. But there is no doubt that the pandemic has accelerated change in how we think about and how we do business and how we organize ourselves. And as Lenin said, it's impossible to predict the time and progress of the revolution. It's governed by its own more or less mysterious laws. And I don't think that any of us could have predicted the revolution that we are experiencing as a result of the pandemic. Today, we're going to explore how we can grow back together, how we can build on the opportunities and meet the challenges of a post-pandemic society and what it has created for us. I opened the conference talking about compassion, and I think that's been a central theme of this pandemic. And I believe that we have the chance to continue to grow our local economy and our social capital through mutual growth and around the ideas of fairness and compassion. The KQ Innovation District is both a knowledge and economic powerhouse. The GVA of the KQ, and that's the gross value added, which is a measure of the value of goods and services produced in the area, industry or sector of an economy. Well, that GVA in 2015 was £43.4 billion. And compare that to the City of London, which produced a GVA only slightly higher in the same year of £46.7 billion. And that GVA is also more than the GVA of Birmingham and Manchester combined. And since 2015, the KQ has grown, and it continues to do so. The challenge is, how do we ensure that growth is sustainable and benefits everyone in the area? The KQ advocates sustainable growth and equitable growth, working with both Camden and Islington and engaging with and advising those undertaking development in the area. The transformation of the KQ has been remarkable over the last 10 years. We've seen developments, with the British Library, King's Cross, the Crick, all across Camden and Islington. It has been truly remarkable. But we potentially have a similar scale of development to come in the forms of, for instance, HS2 and the Euston Station developments, which will be really significant, but also hugely disruptive for local communities. So we have to achieve a balance here. So today we will be discussing and debating what institutions, businesses and communities can do to grow together. Governments talk about change and deliver encouragement through initiatives and strategies such as Building Back Better and Levelling Up. But it is down to local authorities, businesses, HEIs, cultural institutions, charities, communities, in fact, all of the organisations that are members of the KQ to deliver that change. So I'm delighted that we are starting the day with a plenary in which we will hear from the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng MP, Secretary of State at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Thank you.
It's a wonderful thing to be able to speak to an audience filled with so many brilliant minds and inquiring spirits today. The theme of today's conference, Grow Together, is one, of course, I wholeheartedly support. The whole of government is focused on building back better. But we can only call it a true recovery if it works for people in every part of society, in every corner of the UK. Today, I want to speak about three things that I think will be critical to our recovery: innovation, skills, and of course, levelling up. The pandemic has highlighted the value of innovation. Without the brainpower of British scientists who led efforts to create a vaccine, the freedoms we're all enjoying today wouldn't be possible. As we build our way back from the pandemic, innovation will help level up the UK by driving economic growth and creating skilled local jobs. A great example of this is the recent £75 million joint investment from government, business and academia to create technologies of the future. I recently visited a Knowledge Quarter partner, the Francis Crick Institute, which is joining up with British pharmaceutical firm GSK to accelerate medicine discovery. It was great to see innovation in action. The government's new £800 million Advanced Research and Invention Agency will support the groundbreaking discoveries that can transform people's lives. Our innovation strategy, published in the coming weeks, will take a strategic look at how innovation can drive economic growth and support increased business investment in R&D and innovation itself. It's also gratifying to see the Knowledge Quarter recognising that it needs to share its resources for the widest possible benefit. Building back better means spreading jobs, spreading skills, and spreading opportunity further and faster than ever before. As far as jobs are concerned, our plan for jobs is helping support businesses to recover and create careers, generating opportunities through Kickstart and sector work programs for young people. As we continue to chart our path to net zero, the Green Jobs Task Force will help us develop plans for 2 million quality green jobs by 2030. In the skills arena, the government is also investing £2.5 billion in the National Skills Fund to help adults gain the valuable skills they need to improve their job prospects. We're committed to ensuring that everyone in the UK who wants to start and grow their own business can do so, regardless of their background. We have the Help to Grow management scheme, which will help 30,000 small enterprising businesses learn new skills, reach new customers, and boost their profitability. Since 2012, the British Business Bank Startup Loan Scheme programme has delivered over 84,000 loans, supporting entrepreneurs with over £740 million of funding. This pandemic has hit communities hard, and so we can all do something to mitigate that damage. The Prime Minister will publish the landmark Levelling Up white paper later this year, focusing on improving living standards, growing the private sector, and increasing and spreading opportunity. There is, of course, the £4.8 billion Levelling Up Fund, which will invest in infrastructure that improves everyday life, including regenerating high streets, upgrading local transport, and investing in cultural and heritage assets. The Knowledge Quarter, as you know, has a small physical radius, but it has an unparalleled reach both back into our history and towards our future. The impact your members have on society cannot be overstated. I'd like to thank you and urge you to keep up the excellent work you're doing. For our part, the government is ensuring that our recovery is bolstered by innovation, that quality jobs, skills and real opportunity are spread, unlocking the full potential of all people and places in our country. And that Build Back Better finally means Build Back Better for everybody in the UK.
Good afternoon, everyone. A big thank you to Simon Kane for his welcome and to the Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, for his opening plenary. Thank you all for joining us for this lovely day. I hope everyone's recovered from the excitement last night, and I hope you'll be able to stick around to hear most of this afternoon's proceedings. Before we kick off with our keynote of the day, we'd like to present a short presentation produced by one of our partners, The Place.
Oh, do you want me to speak? Ooby-doo, shooby-doo, our way. Boo-boo-boo-doo-doo-doo. Shooby-doo-doo, our way. Yeah, so this is Sylvia. She's doing a dance film for her masters, okay, in dance. And she's filming me because I'm from the area, growing up in the area, blah, blah, blah. And it's about Chatsworth Road and about what the changes are. There's lots of changes. Some have been good, some have been not so good. And some of the changes benefit some people and some of the changes definitely don't benefit other people. So on the surface of it, it's just a happy dancing film, me dancing and everything. But actually, there's a bit more depth to it to say, right, okay, what's going on? We don't get it. It doesn't make sense. So that's what the film's about. Because people land in these areas from wherever they've landed from, but they don't take time out in understanding how they fit in the big picture. They land and they think we are the big picture, and they're just adding to the fabric. And it's lovely that they're here, but you know, it's not the be all and end all. They're not the people who created it. The wheel has been rolling for a long time. You know, it started off with stone, it went to wood, and now it's rubber with, like, you know, metal rims. You know what I mean? You never create the bloody wheel, you know? Am I getting all poetic? Yeah, like you see this toilet, so that's some really shit that's going down. You see, it was a general toilet for the area, obviously, and then it closed down for ages, and then it reopened, and we thought they were going to reopen it as a public toilet, but no, they didn't. They opened it as a cafe. But the cafe was meant to have been a public community service. It was meant to have been elders, older people, cooking in there and sharing their experience with younger people. It started off like that, and then it got taken over by someone or something, and then it closed down. But the left side was still a toilet. But people can understand, why would you go into the men's side, sitting in there and having tea and coffee over the urinals? All right, exactly. And then that closed down. And then they opened up again, this roof garden thing with like all canopies and proper hipster and heating elements and lights and blah, 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 whatever, that kind of stuff. And then that closed down. And now we can't use our toilets. Now we don't have toilets. You have to go to the public library. Well, there you go. Regeneration. What does that mean to you then? Oh, it doesn't mean a lot to you. The point is, we move on. We bring things up. We develop. We get that. I'm trying to understand the whole world of gentrification, what that really means. Is it a buzzword? Is it a word that is there to frighten people? What does it mean? What's it really about? And then there's also evidence of slowly but surely ejecting family businesses. Here's Andreen, the hairdresser. She's really lovely lady. I'm just going to let her know that she's been filmed. So here's Percy Ingles, which is a family baker's from East London, and you don't see it anywhere else as far as I'm aware. And here's Mighty Meats, the butchers, which has now been closed since Sunday. And what I'm presuming is that they've hiked up the rents and they've had to move on. Very interesting. This family has been around a good 20 years. They knew everybody on the street. Anybody who walked past, he had a conversation. It didn't matter which colour or creed came along. It didn't matter whether you bought any meat or anything. You just used to find out how you're doing, what's happening. Haven't seen your mum for a while. And then it got taken over by someone or something, and then it closed down. I think it's going to be an estate agent. We've already got 5 on the street. It could be a coffee shop. You never know. But I think it's going to be an estate agent. Oh well. Start again.
Fantastic. That was the Yacht Club Swing, a presentation by The Place, in which we saw a pedestrian study an all too politicized question, the regeneration of cities and what happens to those who were there before. I hope you enjoyed it. We are now joined by our keynote speaker, Athian Akek. Now, you've been to conferences before, but how many times have you seen a keynote speaker who's only 18 years old? Athian is an activist, a writer, a speaker. His main areas of focus are climate change, youth violence, and racial inequality. As a part of this, he's written for The Guardian, Independent, Huffington Post, ID Magazine, Huck Magazine, Hunger Mag, and other national newspapers. Additionally, he's in the House of Commons as part of the UK Youth Parliament. Athian also sits on the board of a youth charity and a commission in Camden focusing on economic renewal following the pandemic. Athian, welcome to the Knowledge Quarter Conference. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to hand it over to you. Please give us your keynote.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation here today. I kind of want to touch on the idea of the generational mission and what young people have to do in the face of the profound issues that we face today. So I'm 18. Born in the early 2000s, my generation is just now entering the wilderness of adulthood. We are individually, communally, and collectively attempting to navigate our way through the world. The conditions in which we're doing so are far from easy or stable or predictable. Our most formative years, in which we've forged our identities, perspectives, and viewpoints, have been in an age of seemingly endless crisis. At a speed never seen before, from more perspectives than ever, we've witnessed a thunderstorm of societal transformation, change, and turmoil. From the local to the global, social media has expanded our eyes to new perspectives and allowed us to hear from marginalized voices everywhere. We see beyond physical borders and consume information like no other generation before us. The age promise made to our parents and grandparents' generation that we as humanity are ever progressing, ever reaching towards equality, justice, and peace was not made towards us. The pandemic has only deepened the feeling amongst young people that things have to drastically change. The COVID-19 pandemic, to those who turned a blind eye, to those who are distracted and consumed by their daily life, has exposed some of the deep faults and inequalities in our society. While the pandemic has plunged so many across the world into poverty and destitution, we've seen more than 5 million people become new millionaires. While the most prosperous economies like the UK and the USA are now exiting the pandemic through our purchasing power and economic prosperity, all across Asia and Africa, the pandemic is being prolonged by vaccine shortages. The economic and social damage of the pandemic is deepening. While we wish to push forward to a better post-pandemic world, we have to acknowledge that the pandemic has served to deepen the inequalities within and between countries. That our vision for building back better has to be as big and as bold and as transformational as possible. The pandemic has shown that those who are central to keeping the world running are often undercompensated. The pandemic has shown that when crisis hits, it's the most marginalized who pay the most. The pandemic has shown that when these kind of crises hit, it's those who are marginalized by race, class, or geography who are damaged the most. It's also shown that people are far more empathetic, caring, and community-centered than we think. There is a consensus that we cannot return to the injustices of the past. But without a concrete plan to push us forward, we will sleepwalk back into the inequalities of the past. We will sleepwalk back into a society not too different from the one that we have today. We will sleepwalk back into a society in which we haven't learned the lessons of this pandemic. The near universal recognition that we cannot return to business as usual is a step in the right direction. But steps in the right direction are far from enough. To turn the concept of building back better from rhetoric to reality, My generation must play a key role. And I want to briefly outline today what we have to do. There is a consensus that we cannot return to the past, but without a concrete plan to push us forward, we will return back to what we have today. I also want to touch on what the Knowledge Quarter, these world-leading institutions, can do to support young people locally and nationally. For many young people, the last few years have been one where social activism, movements and causes have spurred us into action on a wide scale. The activism has powerfully influenced public debate, discussion and opinion. The Black Lives Matter movement and the school climate crisis strikes have shaped opinion on the climate crisis and racial injustice. Globally, nationally, and locally, young people are pushing forward these causes. We're shifting the way they're being viewed. In recent polling, 64% of people believed across the world that climate change is a crisis today. The Black Lives Matter process of 2020, which saw 26 million protesting in the USA alone, has shifted public opinion in the UK and across the world on issues of racial injustice. But after these waves of intense protesting, activism, and campaigning, what do we have to say for the material changes themselves? And while it would be naive to believe that change could come in 1 year, we have to be critical and ask, what are the material outcomes? But what is this historical moment calling for? I think it's calling for a fundamental transfer of wealth, resources, and power to marginalized communities. So if we compare inaction to what's happening, we've seen real change. But what we've seen in comparison to what is necessary is falling short. In response to the Black Lives Matter protests, we've seen little concrete action from governments to address disparities in the education system, the economy, the criminal justice system, and beyond. Compared to the threat of climate crisis, we've seen Parliament declare a climate emergency, and multiple world-leading corporations pledge to offset their carbon footprints. But we haven't seen the Green New Deal that we need to see to transform the world. There's a moral clarity that comes with youth, an inexperience that makes us uncompromising and impatient, that pushes us forward to tackle the problems we face head on. We as today's young people possess immense intelligence, energy, drive, and determination. But energy without direction and focus will get us nowhere. For me, generational purpose is what we have to discover, interrogate, and act upon. How are things fundamentally changed? How should we talk about change? How should we fight for it? How should we advocate for it? We've grown up in the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis, which drove a decade of austerity, which has robbed a generation, too many in my generation, of a decent opportunity, of a decent start in life, of safety. We've seen the climate crisis shift from what was perceived wrongly as being a distant problem in the future towards something which is affecting us today. We've seen the rise of social media bring awareness to police brutality and racial injustice faced by Black people all across the world. My generation, I believe, will be remembered in history as Generation Justice. We've come of age in a time where nothing seems certain. The system isn't working, and we're determined to change things. As someone involved in youth activism and politics, I often think about, with the profound challenges ahead of us, how my generation can best work to rethink, reshape, and reimagine the world. When focusing on generational purpose, the pioneering post-colonial thinker, writer, and psychoanalyst, Frantz Fanon, despite writing decades and decades ago, has a lot to tell us. On how each generation should shape the world, he said, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Those are powerful words we should hold in mind today. There's a moral clarity that comes with youth, but what is collectively being asked of us? So for my generation, what is the path towards discovering this mission? What is the path that will take us towards fulfilling this mission? What mistakes will lead us down the road to betraying it? And while I'm speaking from the perspective of a young person, as generations, we are interconnected and interdependent. Our fate is interdependent, and the modes of change we pursue as young people will ultimately impact everyone listening today and beyond. In this speech, I want to talk about what can be done by institutions in the Knowledge Quarter to support the next generation of change makers, the next generation who want to push change, the next generation broadly to pursue change on a local, global, and national scale. I was spurred into activism by the gaps I noticed growing up in a working class community in Camden, between what was being done by those in power and what needed to happen. I and countless other young people see this all around us on a range of issues. In terms of youth violence, an issue which I've campaigned on for more than 2 years, the dominant narrative we see in everyday political debate is that the issue will be tackled through more stop and search, more police on the street, and more prison sentences. In terms of growing up in the communities that politicians are abstractly talking about, I've seen with my own eyes how the closure of youth clubs, the cutting of mental health services, the hollowing out of the welfare state, and the general shredding of this country's social safety net has resulted directly in rises in violence. Between 2018 and 2020, I was privileged enough to be elected the member of Youth Parliament for Camden. Although the role came with many opportunities to meet interesting people, to work with political leaders, to write in national newspapers, to attend amazing events like this, what I got most out of the role was a sense of optimism. A sense that despite all the problems faced by our community, our country, and our world more widely, that there are people who are working diligently, passionately, with commitment and empathy within our communities to tackle the issues we've collectively faced. While my entry into politics and activism was a result of the youth violence that I saw affecting my community and the people around me, there have been many other young people who have been spurred into action by other issues, such as climate change, where there's a profound gap between the scale of the crisis and the action being undertaken by governments and corporations. The climate crisis is here with us today. Once again, there's a profound gap between what is happening and what is needed. The level of action that we are seeing and the level of action the moment calls for. The threat of climate change is here today. What we need, as I will later outline, is a Green New Deal, green infrastructure and green jobs. While the cost of doing so is undoubtedly high, the cost of inaction is even higher. And we must collectively ask ourselves, what do we want for young people and future generations to think of the course of action we chose today? The way I conceptualize history is from having an education which took me beyond the curriculum of the classroom. The history we are typically taught in our classrooms and compulsory education frames history and the past through the lens of the powerful. We study the past through the lens of monarchs, political leaders, those with wealth, power, influence, and status. But this blinds us to the importance of resistance by marginalized people, the profound historical impact of social justice and movements all across the history. This should open our eyes to the impact that we can have today. Learning about everything from the Haitian Revolution and the role it played in the ending of the slave trade, to how the Chartist movement was important in the development of social and political rights in early modern England. This allowed me to reframe the way I view power and contributed to the sense of empowerment that I feel. Change, in my mind, is not achieved by a select few people in powerful positions doing things differently. It's a synthesis of mass effort. It's about a diversity of approaches and perspectives. It's the community organizers working to tackle an issue in their local area. It's the young people mentoring, it's the youth workers mentoring young people to fulfill their potential. It's journalists highlighting ignored perspectives. It's those who work within pre-established institutions in the cultural, economic, political, and charity sector to increase accountability, to reshape purpose for collective good, and to build on true diversity. It's those who are rejecting a place in these institutions and pressuring them from the outside through protesting, campaigning, and political education. It's about artists showing us that another world is possible, using the power of imagination to push us to reach for something beyond we can physically see. And it's us collectively strategizing, working, thinking, and acting on how we can get there. One thing that we have to remember, even in the deepest depths of despair and chaos, that there's always something we can do to improve things. Even as the tides of inequality and injustice continue to pass over our communities, we can always do something to support. As a young person from a working class and Black background, now becoming involved in politics and growing with the platform that I have, I wouldn't be delivering this message today, this keynote, without key mentors and older people in my community and beyond who advised me and told me about the pros and cons of every decision that I've made. I think one of the biggest tragedies in this country is how we fail to harness the power of all young people. We have an education system that too often is not inclusive enough, that too often excludes and kicks out young people, that too often fails to truly harness the potential of everyone in this country. So at this moment, after their spectacular victory yesterday, I want to talk a bit about the English national football team. One of the team's biggest strengths is their diversity, in background, in playing style, in race and class. I know this personally. There are so many young people who are brilliant and excellent from my community and communities like mine. There are so many Raheem Sterlings whose brilliance doesn't just manifest itself in sport, but in so many other aspects of life. I know so many young Black people, so many working class young Black people, so many people that given the right support, the right opportunity, the right mentorship, have so much to contribute in every area, from the corporate world to academia and everything in between. In the face of the big, bold, and profound challenges that your kind of companies and organizations are facing, we cannot afford to leave anyone's potential untapped. But we have to waver from hyper-individualized analysis. Our capacity to shape and change our own lives is there, but still our fates are often decided by how we relate and can navigate the education system and the economy. On these issues, it's a question of power. Who makes the decisions on the key aspects of our lives? It's all about rebalancing the scales of power. We have an excessive concentration of economic, social, and political power amongst a small number of people. In the post-pandemic world, I think three things need to happen that will underpin the progress that we can make. We need corporations we have an excessive concentration of power. And in the post-pandemic world, how we can tackle these three main issues will underpin the level of progress we make. We need corporations and individuals making the most money to pay their fair share of tax. There's a moral and there's a practical argument for it. The pandemic has shown just how interconnected and interdependent we are. Our fates are so intertwined that it's time for once and for all that we abandon the relentless individualism that we too often have in favor of navigating a world with increased awareness of the direct and knock-off effect of our individual and our collective actions. The causes of the divisions that we are living through today are undoubtedly material, but that doesn't give us the complete picture. I think we need to make increased efforts to bring people together from different communities, different parts of the country, who have different outlooks, different perspectives, different opinions, to come together and to realize common ground. I also believe that we need to expand our notion of democracy. The right to free and fair elections is and will remain a key part of our democratic principles, but I think it's time we expand them. We should ask ourselves, how can we give people more control over how their local areas run? How can we give workers more control over how they work? How can we decentralize our decision making? Change is the culmination of pressure and response, working within and across communities. It's conflict and solidarity and everything in between. It's about building a compelling narrative about why the world is the way it is, the capacity for us to shape it, and laying out a roadmap for how we can build a fairer future. It's a synthesis of this collective effort that historically and in the present will push us forward. Taking a singular change will lead us to fail in achieving the change we need. Each of us has talent, experiences, and knowledge to contribute to the ecosystem of change. But collectively, our efforts pursuing the change that we need is what we will deliver change upon. On an individual level, our perceptions of change is a result of our life experiences, what communities where we are from, and the intersections in society we sit at. However, no single group can achieve change independently. The key is to realize the overlap between different social causes, different issues, and to fight for them collectively. I think at the heart of what comes next must be a Green New Deal that works to decarbonize the economy while delivering jobs and investment and opportunities to the country's most marginalized communities. My generation is involved from a myriad of social causes, and the Green New Deal gives us a chance to tackle economic inequality, racial injustice, while tackling the climate crisis. I think pushing for a Green New Deal nationally and internationally is what we need to do. The climate crisis in it is an existential threat to us all, but tackling it through a Green New Deal gives us an opportunity to link together the various social causes and issues that we face. There are two truths that we have to bear in mind when looking at the post-pandemic future. Crises cost those who have the least the most. And further back, when we look at the pages of history, it becomes clear that any major transformation in society, that the most marginalized will lose out. The driving aim of our Green New Deal must be to tackle the threat of the climate crisis while building a more equitable world in the process. As young people, we are impatient when it comes to climate change, an issue that each day is reaching a more irreversible state. All the fights we are fighting are interconnected. There's a link between climate, class, race, and gender inequality, and all the other issues that young people are involved in. The first step, I believe, is a change in narrative and language. We have to make the language we use to talk about the climate crisis walk the fine line between stressing the seriousness of the existential threat we face without tipping into such hopelessness that feeds inaction rooted in dread and fatalism. We have to make a case for how we can tackle the climate crisis and fix the issues we face today. We have to motivate people into having a future worth saving, that they will be committed to saving. We have to make a case for how we can tackle this country's issues through solving the climate crisis. In communities all across the country, from the inner cities to the left behind towns, from Cornwall to Camden, a Green New Deal would bring jobs, investment, and infrastructure to communities who've been economically marginalized and not seen the fruits of post-financial crisis economic growth. My generation must be unrelenting in our pursuit of progress. When hope is lost, we have to continue to count our blessings, remember the people who have fought harder battles than us, and stick to the plan. We have to be a generation that works to bring people together when we reach our most divisive moments. We have to be a generation that strives forward to change, even when there's resistance. We have to be a generation that recognizes the fundamental interconnectedness of the human experience and acts forward from there. We have to be a generation that endeavors to put the value of human life above that of profit, that puts action over indifference. We have to be a generation that resists the pull of fatalism in the face of hopelessness. We have to be a generation that turns pain into empowerment. We have to be the generation that turns loss and underappreciated stories of resistance, courage, and bravery in the face of injustice in the pages of history. We have to be a generation that recognizes the weight of the moment we are living in. We are truly at the crossroads of history, between building something fairer, more equitable, and more just, or sleepwalking back into the injustice of the past. We have to recognize that we are in a moment of tragedy, but that we can reach for the most bold and most transformational and biggest change possible. We have to look back in the decades to come and to be rest assured that whatever happens, we did what was needed of us. We did what this historical moment was called for. We did what was right. Thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic. Athian, there's so much there. I was trying to scribble notes and questions, but there's so much to cover. You've really articulately talked about what people of your age, your generation, the problems, and also you've tried to outline some of the possible solutions. We've got a few questions from the audience. I'm going to actually start with that. So the first one is, do you have any plans to run as MP for the House of Commons in the future? We need more voices like yours alongside those in power. That's from Rob Singh. Tell us about your ambitions of becoming an MP, Athian.
I think it's something I'm definitely interested in. I think the way that I kind of answer this type of question typically is that, look, entering politics, becoming an MP, that's all well and good. But it's up to those moments where you're there and you're in the right place at the right time. But committing and being there for your community and trying your best to do what is right by the people beside you is something you can do at any moment in whatever position you're in. So if I find myself becoming MP, that's something that would be great. But I think I'm committed to kind of working as best as I can to tackle the issues faced by my community. But I'm definitely not scared of trying to enter into those type of spaces, because I recognize that there are not that many people who are like me from my background who are given that kind of opportunity to enter there.
How did you become a youth MP for Camden? How did that happen? What was the journey?
So basically, it was in 2018, and they kind of did an assembly where they were like, "Does anyone want to run to be youth MP?" And then, so that it's usually like one candidate from each school, and there were 3 from my school. One of them dropped out. We were all friends, so there were 2 people from my school, and then I just ran. I recorded a campaign video, then I ended up winning.
It's fantastic. You talked about the need for communities to have more control of the local area. So if you had a magic wand, and if local communities in the Knowledge Quarter area, in the King's Cross, Euston, Bloomsbury area, could have more say in how the local area is run, where should they begin? What are the key things that they should be talking about, and the key changes that they should be making, in your opinion?
In terms of from the communities or from the Knowledge Quarter? The
From
community.
and then the Knowledge Quarter as well, both.
I think they're all kind of interconnected, because if we look at the Knowledge Quarter, you have world-leading institutions who are kind of contributing to the knowledge that we have. But we also have a community who have a lot to contribute to these institutions. And these institutions have a responsibility to these communities. So I think in terms of there's kind of 3 ways that I think about this. I think if we look at from the perspective of young people, one thing that I'd want to see Knowledge Quarter organizations is try to actively engage with young people and to provide opportunities, because like we have Google in this area, we have loads of world-leading institutions. So I want to think, how can we get the schools that we have locally, how can we use that world-leading knowledge to help contribute? How can we bring young people from the range of backgrounds seen in Camden into those buildings? How can we give those life-changing opportunities to young people? Like, because the institutions are literally there. It's a question of coordination and action. Because it's kind of a mutualistic thing. We're in a world in which these institutions, the Knowledge Quarter institutions, are vying and speaking to increasingly globalized and diverse audiences. You have one of the most diverse communities, arguably in the world, right at your doorstep. So one thing that I want to see is that kind of active engagement. How can we create young work experience opportunities for young people? But then one thing I want to touch on is this idea of corporate social responsibility. Because I think as a result of being in this area, that these corporations and institutions have a responsibility to the local community. And so one thing I want to think is, how can we have accountability? How can we make sure that in the decisions being made by the Knowledge Quarter in the coming years, both geographically and beyond, that we can make sure that we have that direct link and communication with the various communities in our area? But I think it's all a question of dialogue and space. It's about how can we get young people from all across our communities, to actually know and be interconnected with these institutions. And that's something that I'd definitely be kind of interested in working on in the future.
Yeah. One more question has come from the Hublot conferencing site. It's estimated that fewer than 85 people own half the world's wealth. What are your thoughts on how we can influence more of those people to sign the pledge developed by Bill and Melinda Gates to encourage the super rich to give their wealth away, and to give it away for benefit of many?
I think we have to challenge our increasing propensity towards philanthropy, because it's not just a question of how these individuals have become so wealthy and what they do after. It's about the processes by which they've acquired this wealth. Look, I'm not someone who's going to sit here and say that no one should ever acquire any wealth. I think that's silly and that doesn't make sense. But this level of, I think, what I fundamentally get from speaking to people about wealth inequality is that it's all about a perception and a reality that we're in a fair system. It's not about everyone having absolutely the same. It's about us. We have to feel and we have to have a reality in which everyone's playing by the same rules. And so this question of amassing that much wealth and giving it away, we have to ask, how have these people amassed this much wealth? And I personally believe that the best way, in terms of people who are super wealthy, in order for their funds and wealth to be redistributed, is not through philanthropy, it's through taxation. I think taxation is a fundamentally much more democratic way of deciding how your wealth is used. And I think this issue about taxation is really important, because we live in a society in which there's a kind of idea that if we tax the rich over a certain threshold, the kind of our economic system is going to fall apart. And this is factually not true. There was a point in the USA towards the kind of the point of World War II where they had a top rate of tax of 91%. And I'm not saying we have to return to that, But we have to return into a situation in which the rich are paying their fair share of money, because ultimately the wealth in our society is not just a question of capital or labor. It's about the collaboration between these. It's about the workers who are on the floors of our shops generally being reimbursed for how they contribute and underpin the economic system. So to that question, I would kind of finish with one line. Generosity is not the substitute for justice.
Right.
Generosity is not the substitute for justice.
Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful quote to end your keynote on. Thank you, Athien. I know you're going to stick around for the panel discussion. So we're about to introduce the panelists. I'll introduce the session. So today's theme of the conference is growing together. Without the bedrock of worthwhile, fairly paid work, it is a challenge for families and communities to succeed. To ensure that local communities don't just survive, but thrive, we need to put the way the economy works at the front and center of our thinking. Both Camden and Islington councils have formulated powerful citizen-led visions for inclusivity. And in today's session of the conference, we will dive into these visions and the challenges that remain. Supporting local businesses through buy local commitments is a definite area of opportunity, although obviously constrained by local supply, which is in turn affected by diversity issues, most notably in the shocking underrepresentation of women-owned businesses when it comes to securing supply contracts. Can Knowledge Quarter partners rally people at a local level, building momentum for change while simultaneously looking up and outwards for other partners in the KQ who share that vision? How can we integrate services locally, co-design approaches with citizens, and work with businesses to form a coalition that can reprogram the area's economy and make it fair for all? We're going to look towards finding answers to these and other questions in this next panel, The Future of Growing Together. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers for this panel. We've already met Athien, so he's going to be staying on. Ian Golding is Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford and leads the Oxford Martin programs on the future of work, technological and economic change, and the future of development. Prior to becoming the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, he was vice president of the World Bank, after serving as chief exec of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and as an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. He's also worked as principal economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London and as program director of the OECD in Paris. He's served as a non-exec director on the boards of leading businesses, who's received a knighthood from the French government and has advised many international organizations and governments. He's a regular keynote speaker on TED, Google, Zeitgeist, and at Davos, and now a Knowledge Quarter. Sarah McKinley is Director for European Programs at the Democracy Collaborative. In her capacity directing their European programs, Sarah is building transatlantic partnerships to develop new community wealth building models and learning exchanges to advance the democratic economy in the United Kingdom and continental Europe. She has a background in community development and has worked with community development organizations at all different levels. Whilst earning her master's degree in urban and regional planning at Cornell University, Sarah was a co-author and coordinator of A People's Plan for New Orleans, a bottom-up community development plan for the 9th Ward after Hurricane Katrina. She holds a bachelor's degree in urban history from the University of Chicago. Adam Lent is chief exec of New Local, formerly known as the New Local Government Network, an independent think tank and local government network with a mission to transform public services and unlock community power. His previous roles include director of the RSA Action and Research Center and head of economics and social affairs at the Trades Union Congress. Adam was co-author of the New Local's paper, The Community Paradigm, Why Public Services Need Radical Change and How It Can Be Achieved. Our participatory chair for the session is Jennifer Nadell, a qualified barrister, author, speaker, campaigner, and award-winning journalist. She's reported for the BBC, Channel 4, and ITN around the world. She's an inspirational speaker on topics including women's rights, personal transformation, and political reform, and provides training for individuals and organizations on compassion and purpose. As ITV's Home Affairs editor, she was one of the UK's most senior female television correspondents. Her most recent book, co-authored with Gillian Anderson, explores women's rights. Her most recent film told the story of Grenfell survivors still living in hotels. She's the co-founder of Compassion in Politics. It's an absolute thrill to welcome all of you to the Knowledge Quarters conference. Thank you all for joining. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for those introductions, and it's wonderful to have all our esteemed panelists here. I thought we'd start by each of us taking up to 2 minutes to set out our stall, what our thinking is about how we can build back together. Who would like to start? Adam, you're next to me, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay, good as reason as any. I'm Adam Lent, Chief Exec of New Local. My attention was really caught yesterday by a really interesting report that came out from the Institute for Community Studies, which looked at levelling up, attempts at levelling up over the last 20 years. And they did a sort of economic assessment of the impact of that. And their assessment was that in the space of 2 decades, all the various efforts at levelling up had made literally zero difference to the economic standard of living, the well-being of the most deprived communities in the country. And, you know, that shocking finding, obviously there's a number of reasons behind that. But I think one of the most significant is that we tend to think of these issues in purely economic terms, as though the solution is purely about funneling money into the most deprived parts of the country. And of course, that's a very important part of it. But what we so repeatedly overlook is the importance of power and influence. And these communities are, one of the reasons they're so deprived is because they're economically marginalized, is because they're also politically marginalized. And that's why at New Local and other organizations now recognizing that one of the solutions to the issue of building back better and making sure that all communities can benefit from that is actually about redistributing power as well as wealth. And I'm pleased to say that increasingly within the public sector anyway, there is a recognition of the importance of that.
Wonderful, thank you, Ian. Excuse the lockdown dogs in the background. Sarah, can I come to you next?
Yes, of course, and thank you, Jennifer, and it's a real honor to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues and speakers, so thank you very much for having me here. As Bob said, I'm Sarah McKinley. I'm the Director of European Programs for the Democracy Collaborative, which, as mentioned, is a research and design hub for the democratic economy that advances new models and visions for a democratic economy on both sides of the Atlantic. So getting at what, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Athian, but getting at some of the points that Athian was just speaking about, and also to Adam's point about redistributing power and wealth, we think it's really important to democratize the economy. And why do we need to do that? Again, as Athian was just speaking about, right now, ownership and control of our economy is concentrated to a degree is not seen since before the Great Depression. And more that wealth is in the hands of an ever increasing few who extract wealth and resources from our communities and destroy our planet and break our bodies and ruin our health. And we're seeing this day in and day out, and we're reaping the effects of that in this current crisis of COVID. So we posit that you cannot have a system that is half democratic and half plutocratic. And we are already seeing that our plutocratic economy is essentially eating our democratic politics. So we believe that in addition to changing power and wealth, we need to alter ownership structurally of the economy. So we believe that you need a revolution in ownership, changing who owns and controls capital and productive assets in place, so that we're not just tinkering around the edges of an already destructive system, but fundamentally restructuring our system so that it not only works in service to community, but actually produces positive outcomes by its natural functioning. So you heard Athien talk about taxes and redistribution. What we want to talk about is pre-distribution, building institutions and creating structures within our society that don't actually result in that kind of concentrations of wealth that we're seeing right now. And at the Democracy Collaborative, we believe that we can do this. We believe that it's already being done, and it's being done from the local level all the way up through what we call community wealth building, which is a system-changing approach to place-based economic development that produces broadly shared and collective economic prosperity through the direct reconfiguration of our economic institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic ownership, worker participation, and community control in our economy. I'm looking forward to really talking about concrete examples of this that are happening throughout the UK and throughout the world. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Ian?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be part of this, and particularly to hear Athien, who I thought was absolutely inspiring prior to us. My focus at the moment is on thinking about how the pandemic could lead to a better world, and although that might sound paradoxical or naive because it's such a terrible experience for so many around the world, I do think that these crises do provide a real opportunity. And my new book, which is called Rescue: From Global Crisis to Better World, goes through 14 different dimensions of this, and particularly the future of cities and how they can be rethought about, as well as inequality. Athien mentioned the post-war period and the high tax rates in the US and the UK, instituted by conservative governments in both continents and then across Europe. But it wasn't just high taxation. It was a whole new vision for the world, the welfare state, the Beveridge Report, and a vision for the world. Unlike the First World War, which many people were scarred by, leading to reparations being paid by the poor and increasing inequality within and between countries. In the Second World War, 3% of US income was given to Europe, to the losers in the war, as an act of solidarity to learn the lessons of that. And of course, institutions like the World Bank were created for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan at the time. So can this lead to a new way of thinking? My view, it already has. We are seeing governments do things that were unimaginable in January 2020. It's led to behavior changes that were unimaginable for all of us. I never thought I would live in a society where the Prime Minister would tell me when to hug someone, but it's happened. And we accept that because we believe it's in our common interest. And that really is what it's about, moving from I to we, from me to us, not only within countries, but between countries. And the community, and Camden and Islington demonstrate this forcefully, because some of the greatest inequalities in the country are in London. So the paradox about the levelling up agenda is it implies that poverty is somehow in the north, but actually it's within us. It's in the southeast. It's certainly in London, where some of the poorest boroughs in the UK are, and it's in the world. We need to get beyond the hyperbole of government, where they say they're going to give and take, austerity and all of that, and really see this as a wake-up call. If not, all the suffering is in vain. But if this is the pandemic to stop pandemics, to lead us to cooperate on climate change, and to lead to greater solidarity within our communities, I believe that we would have learned the lesson of the Second World War, and that we can create a better world.
Wonderful, thank you. Athien.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for a lot of the kind words from some of the panelists who seem a lot more qualified than me. I haven't even got an undergrad degree yet, but on the way. I think the kind of I want to talk a bit about how young people can be involved in this process. I think there's kind of an immense moral clarity that comes with being young, that we're seeing the world through fresh and new perspectives, and I think that is what is pushing, in a political sense, the increasing kind of demand for redistribution, pre-distribution, the kind of fundamental shift in the way that things are run. Because if we look at, there was an interesting essay that I read from my kind of university application by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. And his basic fundamental argument that was the 1980s kind of brought an end to the kind of political evolution. His idea was that we kind of reached the point where liberal capitalist democracy, in which we had kind of some redistribution of wealth, but kind of fundamentally allowing inequality to grow, and this principle that would trickle down. But I think the pandemic has shattered any kind of perception and idea that this is a way we can actually run society. The problem with the kind of neoliberal perspective on the world is that it fails to show just how interconnected we are, just how interdependent we are, that none of us can act with the kind of autonomy and disregard for one another. And I think that's shown in the way that the pandemic has happened in the UK and the government's response. If we look at their hesitance to lockdown in the first scenario was because of a kind of idea that people wouldn't follow the rules. But we've seen, with some variation, that people are far more empathetic and caring and community-centered than the powerful like to think. The kind of the polling currently shows that people support overwhelmingly more action on climate change by the government. They support higher taxation. But I think that the role that young people can play politically is what we're doing with the social movements that we're leading, pushing for racial justice, pushing for kind of redistribution of wealth and power, pushing for real transformational and bold change. Because I think kind of politics right now is not a position where this is being reflected. And because I think kind of this is a bit of a backlash by those who empower to this kind of increasing societal consensus that we can't go back into what we had before. But I think over time, when my generation comes to positions of power, you'll never return to a day when an election is basically kind of tinkering around the edges type situation. We're here for bold, fundamental, transformational change. And while we don't have the masters and the PhDs, I think there's knowledge that everyone can provide to this situation, and that young people have to, we can learn it in a kind of cross-generational transfer of knowledge, because we can provide perspectives that you guys need, and you guys have the knowledge that we need to think about how can we technically and materially change the world. Because these big and bold ideas are cool and they're necessary. It's also about transferring that into minute differences and the practical implementation of change.
Very inspiring. Thank you, Athien. And I'll just say a little bit about Compassion in Politics, which is the organisation I co-founded 2.5 years ago, really at the sight of seeing refugees dying at sea and the demonisation of those that flee for their lives. My own father came to the UK as a child refugee on the Kinder transport, and if he were in a similar situation today, he would not have been allowed into the UK. So what has happened to our politics since that post-war settlement? Our analysis is that compassion has been edged out, and we have really lost our moral compass politically, economically, and societally. So we founded Compassion in Politics with the aim of bringing compassion back into the picture, of it being seen as a legitimate and necessary political driver and a valid one. We work in Parliament, we have active engagement from over 100 MPs, and we work both on the substance of policies and laws, but also on the way in which politics is conducted. You know, every time we watch Prime Minister's Questions, we see bullying, harassment, a hierarchical, abusive situation that would not be tolerated in any other workplace. And yet we view it as some kind of normal way of conducting political business. And that has to change. And one of the things I love about what you're saying, Athien, is that you're seeing things as they really are. And those degrees and that education and that constant exposure to things as they are can numb us to how things ought to be. And we begin to normalize things which are completely not normal and completely not acceptable. And, you know, as you and Ian said, we believe very profoundly that this pandemic has, amongst the tragedy and the heartbreak and the loss, has created a pause and a moment. And that moment feels like it's closing pretty fast. I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. I don't think we have a lot of time to make the most of it. And on top of the societal changes, it's what happened to the environment. You know, our travel was shut down. and we still managed to function. We weren't allowed to commute, and we still managed, in many industries, not all obviously, to function. And our priority coming out of this should be finding a way that addresses social inequality and climate change together, because they are all intimately connected. Compassion is something that can either be encouraged or discouraged by a culture. We have lived in one where individualistic self-interest and competitive self-interest has been lionized as the driver. The endless pursuit of growth and wealth has completely obliterated the things that we know matter most, the things in our own lives we know that matter most, and that again the pandemic enabled us to connect with. And Professor Michael Marmot's work on how we build back fairer and health inequalities has got to be, for me, at the core of anything that we do moving forward. Our priority has to be well-being and health, equality and climate justice. It can no longer be the pursuit of wealth and the continued lie that all we need is for the rich to get richer and society will be transformed. So lots and lots to talk about. And I thought I'd start by just asking each of you to expand a little bit on what you said. And Sarah, I wondered if I could start with you. You talked about some concrete examples. You also mentioned New Orleans. I don't know if that's a relevant one, but I'd love to hear how, how do you revolutionize power, and how could that apply to the Knowledge Quarter here?
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, and of course, with all things, there are many different ways to come about this. And in this moment, I think we need to promote all solutions, and I think those solutions exist on the ground. And so I'll speak a little bit about some of the community wealth building work that myself and my organization and our partners in the field have been working on. As you can tell by my accent, I'm originally an American, even though I live in Brussels these days, and work a lot in the UK. So I'll speak to an American example, not necessarily New Orleans, although there's a lot to dig into there. But I'll speak to our work in Cleveland, Ohio, where we have worked with a collaboration of community-based organizations and what we call anchor institutions. So institutions that are rooted in place, like hospitals, universities, city government, cultural institutions that aren't going to get up and leave, and are often the largest employers and purchasers of goods and services in most communities. And we worked with this collaborative of community actors and institutions to really address these issues of inequality that we're talking about. Why do these institutions, much like those in the Knowledge Quarter, have so much economic might and impact and capacity that's really disconnected from the communities immediately surrounding them? And in a place like Cleveland, where you're talking about poverty statistics sort of second only to places like Detroit, where you have huge level of deindustrialization, disinvestment, and other things in communities. And as a result, you're seeing huge disparities in things like health. The mainly African-American communities in the downtown core of Cleveland have a 20-year life expectancy difference from the affluent white suburbs just about 8 miles away outside of Cleveland. So you're looking at huge health disparities, you're looking at huge economic disparities, child literacy, all the poverty statistics that we're unfortunately so used to hearing. And yet you have these institutional actors right there in the center of Cleveland that are some of the most prestigious in that region in the US. And why are those things not connected? So we worked concertedly to figure out how the economic impacts of those institutions could more intentionally connect to benefit those communities immediately surrounding them, and work together with the community to create a network of employee-owned, all sustainable, all green, industrial scale cooperatives that provide goods and services directly to those institutions in place. So right now, this has been a project that's been ongoing for over 10 years. There are now actually 5 cooperatives in the network. As I said, they're all employee-owned, and that means that the people that work in these cooperatives share in the profits of the enterprises, and also access benefits such as, for example, there's a housing support program where they can buy houses in the community. There are other things like financial literacy, and they also get to have a say and a vote in the operations of those enterprises in place. They're also part of a network that then has a revolving loan fund. So part of the profit goes back into that to continue to grow the capacity of the cooperatives as well as the community to connect into those cooperatives. And actually, they've recently started a fund that supports actually buying up enterprises that would otherwise be asset stripped or closed or go out of business, buying them up and converting them into employee ownership so that the people working in those enterprises can save their jobs and actually create benefit for themselves and for their community in place. So that's just one example of a way to connect sort of economic activity to communities that really can benefit from the creation of that wealth and locally.
Yeah, fascinating. And Ethan, I'm going to come to you at the end and ask you which of these ideas you think would work for this community as a representative and of this community. Adam, how do we make public services better? How do we have a revolution and democratization of them?
Well, three really quick points that I think are key. The absolute starting point has got to be devolution of powers away from Westminster. We have far, far too much power and resource wrapped up in Westminster. It completely disempowers local government, which in turn completely disempowers local communities. I mean, for just a very quick example, I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous, for example, that decisions about things like training and skills and getting people back into work are taken in the DWP in Westminster. I mean, the country is so economically diverse. How any centralized system of employment support can work is just illogical. So firstly, we need fundamental devolution of powers. That's just a sort of beginning. But even if we did have a completely decentralized country, we'd need to take decisions in a fundamentally different way in order to empower communities. I think the first is really about the big decisions we take. So the big strategic decisions we take, whether they're taken centrally or locally, are still really taken in a very institutionalized, elitist way, where there's this idea that we elect our representatives, they go off and sit in the council chamber or in parliament and take decisions on our behalf. We need a much more participatory, open system. And there are really great examples going on all over the world, especially the sort of citizens' assembly movement, but there's all sorts of other ways of doing it. And Camden have done really great work in using citizens' assemblies to bring residents into decision-making. One of the most interesting developments recently in that regard is Newham Council, which have now set up a permanent citizens' assembly. So this isn't a citizens' assembly to come together for a brief period of time and take a decision on one issue. It's a permanent assembly of citizens to be continuously involved in the big strategic decisions that the council takes. And the third big shift we need is about the little decisions we take as a state, as public sector. So the public sector, public servants take millions and millions of decisions every day about how they work with service users, how they work with vulnerable people, how they support communities. And that really needs to move to a much more collaborative, open approach, move away from that paternalist idea that the public servant is some sort of parent and everyone else is a child they have to care for, to work in a much more egalitarian way. And I'll give one really practical example of that, which I think is one of the most exciting examples in this sort of sphere. So this is the example of Healthier Fleetwood, where a GP, Mark Spencer, in Fleetwood, very marginalised, deprived community up in the northwest, been the GP there for many years, literally sitting in his surgery, writing prescriptions out to exactly the same people over and over again, just managing their conditions and their sort of chronic long-term conditions. And at one point he said, this is totally hopeless. This sort of medicalized model of supposedly helping people is doing nothing of the sort. So he left his surgery, got out into the community, and has encouraged the community to basically set up groups and networks to start taking responsibility for their own health and well-being, taking decisions for themselves. And it's led to this amazing flourishing of mental health networks, singing groups, women's creative, all sorts of things to address those deep-seated health concerns. So that's just a little example of how if you change the way you think as a public servant and work with the community and put the community in the driving seat, it can be utterly transformational.
Thank you. Ian, we've heard that levelling up, despite everyone, talking the talk, nothing substantial has really changed. I know you've written a whole book about it, but can you give us some top-line thoughts on what business could do to actually bring about some of the changes that we want to see in our communities?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. There's a whole lot that needs to be done urgently, and devolution's a great idea, but when the money's all in one place, like in certain boroughs of London and offshore tax havens and things, we've got to be very careful that devolution doesn't increase inequalities, make rich places even richer, unless the rich places are part of a federal system. And I'm thinking about the world here, where there is redistribution to countries and to places within countries. So if London and the Southeast evolved, that would not be good for the rest of the country. And so how you match devolution of political power with centralization of redistribution is, I think, a critical question. The other thing that I think is very difficult, but I believe strongly, is that there is, over time, an evolution of where jobs are and the dynamism of jobs. And obviously in King's Cross, we're sitting in one of the most dynamic places. And there are parts of the country that will never really recover their heyday in the past, with no amount of money being thrown at them. And I think what we need to understand is that in a lot of what development is about for countries and individuals' lives is moving. Jennifer, you talked about your roots. The same is true of me, but the same is true of everyone. That's the process of migrating within countries and between countries is central to how one escapes poverty and how one gets new opportunities and how one escapes conflict and pogroms and everything else. So the question for me is about how do we make things work to enable people to move more easily to where opportunities are as well. And that's about housing markets, which are absolutely crucial and are completely broken in the UK to get a place. They're about schooling places. They're about places in childcare. They're about the ability of people to commute over longer distances. So public transport and the affordability of it is absolutely crucial. It's about how we create a society where you can get to where the jobs are. Taking jobs to people is possible, but it's a lot harder and a lot more expensive and takes much longer than moving people to where jobs are. Now, in constituency politics like the UK, this is even harder because no MP is going to stand up in their constituency and say, actually, your future is elsewhere. That's just politically impossible for people. And that locks us into an economic geography of the past in a much stronger way than in some other countries where people basically see their future somewhere else. How you combine that with the need to have rootedness in communities, identity in communities, history, the importance of communities and solidarity with communities is the key question. And obviously that's about many, many things, but I don't think it's viable to think that everyone everywhere is going to have an incredible opportunity. What they need to be guaranteed is a minimum standard of living in terms of healthcare, education, housing, and everything. I think those basic foundations of a democratic society, that no one in our society will be in poverty, no one will have poor health, no one will not be given access to food, is necessary. And we've seen, not least in the pandemic, that just collapsing. Millions and millions of people relying on food banks, millions of people finding they can't pay the rent and in fear of homelessness, and many more millions being unemployed. And that's really what's got to be part of the change agenda.
Thank you. I'll just do my little bit and then we're going to come to you, Athien, to see what you would cherry pick out of what we've said and apply locally. You know, for us at Compassion in Politics, we think the very, very least is that 2 tests should be applied to the actions of governments, individuals, organisations. And the first test should be, is what I'm proposing to do going to leave those in the most vulnerable circumstances worse off? If the answer is yes, you just got to find another way of doing it. It's no longer acceptable for governments and those with power to make decisions and implement policies which do damage to those who are already struggling to have a stake in this society. And the second is, what is the impact of what I'm going to do on future generations and specifically on climate change? And if it's going to make it worse, you have to find another way of doing it. So we think that a compassionate society, and this can be applied to organisations, businesses, public services, needs to have those 2 questions at its forefront. We would also like to see Section 1 of the Equality Act adopted, which is the socio-economic duty, which would give those rights that Ian just mentioned. But it would be really great in this conversation, given that we can't get the current juggernaut in Westminster to change direction. What can we do irrespective of what is happening in Westminster? What can we do locally? And I think that a big part of it also comes down to psychology. You know, we are not taught about psychology in schools. You know, we're not taught about the role of the ego. We're not taught about what happens when we're triggered, what happens when we're in fight or flight. And whenever we're in a competitive or aggressive situation, which many of these decision-making forums are, we will be triggered to a greater or lesser extent into rather unhelpful ways of reaching decisions, thinking and interacting with each other. So that's why we really would like to see more compassion-based training at every stage of life and involved in decision makers and leadership and schools and every level, to really get that basic psychological awareness so that we can take decisions from a basis of our whole self, not our kind of using our reptilian brain that wants us to power through. And finally, I'm very troubled when I hear about the geographical mobility that Ian talks about. I'm troubled because I'm a child of the 70s, and I remember what happened when Norman Tebbit said that everyone had to get on their bike and travel to where the jobs were. And I've seen firsthand the decimation of long-standing support groups. And as a woman and as a mother, you know, these communities are so vital, and we really dismantle them at our peril. So I'm interested in finding a way of achieving what you want to achieve, Ian, but being able to allow people to have that geographical rootedness that we do see in other countries, not in the States, but we do see elsewhere. Athien.
I think kind of in a political sense, I think the role of people involved in politics in the coming generation is to synthesize this kind of academically produced knowledge, but to try and convert it into something which can be as widely consumed and understood and like enacted as possible. And I think we need a synthesis of all these different ideas about economic power, about social power, about political power, because all these things are interconnected. But I think one thing I want to touch on and add on is that the concept and notion of success is a powerful force in British society. Even young people who are involved in a myriad of social causes and who share things on social media, every day I think there's a kind of tension between our vision for individualized success and our understanding and idea of the collective future and our interconnectedness. And I think to kind of return to this probably is an unusual reference point, but have any of you guys listened to this album called To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar? And essentially it's a kind of reckoning with his new found position in society as a kind of voice of a generation. And he kind of artistically portrays this conflict between his individualized kind of desires and needs and what he needs to do for his community. And I think that's something that we need to shift our societal notion of what success is. Is success purely the acquisition of wealth, power, and resources? Or is there a deeper notion that we can come up with success in terms of the way our community is structured, the quality of our climate? And these aren't kind of utopian, excessively moralistic ideas. This is about literally what is the immediate conditions of the people who are in our community. And I think in terms of Camden's somewhere where you can see that people can have solidarity without necessarily there being sameness in their experience. As in, my parents are from South Sudan. There are people whose parents are from massively different parts of the world who I go to school with or went to school with. I just finished my A-levels. But in this environment, in this community and being together, we can recognize that it's kind of cliche, but that our commonalities far outstrip the way that we are different. Because even if you look at the kind of the different resurgences of the multiple like outsider political movements, whether it's Brexit, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, the kind of way that the pandemic has manifested itself in different parts of our country, there are different reflexes and different approaches towards how we need to change the world. As in, there are different communities who desire slightly different visions of the future. But still, there's this fundamental narrative about a lack of control of our lives, a lack of control of the type of housing that we have, over the economy. And that fundamental reflex is what I think we need to tap on. Because like the key is that even as we pursue these kind of individualized, localized responses, the kind of the worker ownership, the ideas about devolution or the migration of people internally, we still can't ignore that the power in Westminster has massive sway in this country. And it's about how do we convert the individualized experience of our communities to build a dominant narrative for how the country can be changed, and how can we hopefully translate that into a kind of electoral mandate. Because I'll finish on this. I think the biggest thing that I wanted to get across when I was doing that keynote is that some of us have to be inside the system and try and build receptiveness within the system, and some of us have to completely reject it and work outside it in terms of radical protesting, radical political education. And it's about that synthesis of response and pressure is what's going to translate some of these ideas into actually coming into life.
Brilliant, thank you. Now we're going to have to open up for questions in a minute, but I just wondered if we were constructing a manifesto, or let's say a program of action for the Knowledge Quarter to incorporate some of the ideas that we brought to it here, what would each member of the panel pick out and want to do, or if there are any points that anyone else has raised, do you feel free to build on them or to argue or discuss? Who would like to go first? Something concrete that can be done. Sarah, I was very taken by the work that you're doing, which seems to have a direct relationship to what's happening on the ground here.
Absolutely, and it's happening all over. And you know, most recently, I've been in dialogue with the GLA, the Greater London Authority, around what they've recently launched in March of this past year, their Anchor Charter, which is getting institutions across London to sign on to commit to change the way that they do business in a way that more positively interacts with communities, and particularly with youth and youth employment across London. And so just as a very sort of easy, I think, well, not easy, but a first step in the Knowledge Quarter is those institutions can look at this Anchor Charter and consider participating, consider getting involved, thinking about how they redirect their purchasing, how they hire, how they do so in a way that is connected directly to the needs and the capacity of community, and particularly communities most in need. And you know, I think, as we've all been saying, this moment of COVID has really, you know, the Greek root for the word apocalypse is unveiling. We're in a bit of an unveiling. You know, we've recognized how important and how necessary and how central community is to our health and viability, and really understanding how we, you know, take we've been operating in sort of this globalized ether, and how we really need to root back into community, and how local institutions are a huge part of that. So the Knowledge Quarter can play a really powerful role in doing that, by redirecting their behavior intentionally to communities most in need.
And just very quickly, if you can, in a nutshell, if the kind of community wealth building program that you mentioned were to really happen on a proper scale here, how would that be started, or is it already happening here?
It's already happening. It's happening throughout the UK, and in fact, a number of boroughs in London, Islington, Newham, others have already really moved forward community wealth building activities in place, and that looks like, in places like Islington, as was said earlier, we're not, we don't have a problem of wealth creation. What we have a problem with is equity, and how to make sure that wealth is connected to the people who generate the wealth and the people who could benefit most from it. And so we're really talking about equity. So it'll take different forms, community wealth building, in different places. And that could be anything from things like, and we've talked about housing and the need to create viable and affordable housing for people. And we're seeing the importance of that in this moment. So things like community land trusts, schools for collectively owning land and housing in place, so that they're not just speculative wealth creation for a few. So things like community land trusts are an example, and there's a robust community land trust network across the UK advancing that kind of work. Things like reinvesting your pension fund money. How is that money going to benefit community, and not just creating wealth for stockholders, for example. So how to think about how to use your pension funds, for example, how to create capacity building funds. I know Adam's done a lot of work around creating a fund to build capacity for plural forms of enterprise ownership, so that more people can get involved in owning and controlling enterprise. So there's a lot of this activity happening in place. The scale question, I think we're getting there, but I think part of the key to the scale is not only more of these kinds of activities, but connecting them, interconnecting them, so that they're not sort of disparate projects here and there, but part of a cohesive, systemic approach to transforming local economies.
Thank you, Adam. We're not going to see more devolution happen in our time frame, in the time frame that we would like to see it happen. What can this community, for example, do? You mentioned the citizens' assemblies in Newham. What else can be done to try and achieve the aims that you're talking about in the absence of a supportive role from central government?
So I think, in terms of something like the Knowledge Quarter or the councils and other bodies involved in the Knowledge Quarter, I think the lesson that we're learning from those councils, other parts of the state that are really starting to take community power seriously, is that you have to engage communities, particularly the most marginalized communities, in a very specific way. What we've seen so often, particularly from sort of wealthy individuals, wealthy organizations, but also from the state, is they already make up their mind about what those marginalized communities need. And they go to those marginalized communities and say, we really want to help you on A or B. It's knife crime or literacy or whatever it is. They've made the decision already. And that inevitably is immediately alienating to people who've already been disempowered and marginalized. The parts of the public sector, local government elsewhere, that are really starting to make a different type of relationship go in with without any agenda, basically going into communities and saying, what is it you want? What do you want to change? What matters to you? And that is not the sort of question they're usually asked. They're usually told stuff. And it immediately creates a very different conversation. But it also recommends a fundamental truth, which in our very hierarchical, centralized system, we find very difficult to accept, is that actually marginalized communities themselves know best what is required for them to improve the situation they are in. Not civil servants, not academics, excusing present company, not anyone. They know best. And I think once you realize that, it creates a fundamentally different relationship. So I urge the very wealthy, powerful, privileged institutions that are part of the Knowledge Quarter to connect with communities if they really want to help them, but start with that agendaless conversation. Let them take the lead and follow them, rather than siding in your boardrooms that what you really want to do is set up some charitable foundation to improve literacy. Find out where they want to go, not where you think they should go.
And that requires, as Athene was alluding to earlier, a real step change in the way those who have the power to give, how that power relationship can be subtly abused and used as another form of control.
Totally.
Ian, Sarah mentioned the wealth of institutions and organisations. How can we ensure that it isn't mere tokenism, that they are, as Adam said, listening to the needs of the communities that they profess to want to serve? How can we make their actions really meaningful and the sort of actions that are wanted by the community, not just that the board thinks are wanted?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what Adam said, and I've seen it in not only in different communities that I've been engaged with over my career, but also globally. In global institutions think they know what's best for a country, and they don't listen. And of course, politicians think that they know best, particularly autocratic politicians or populist politicians, and they don't consult. So it's absolutely the case. And I've worked with some of the poorest communities in the world who have a very clear idea whether they want water, electricity, or roads, or schooling, or housing first, if they can't have everything at the same time. And I think that applies everywhere. It also, I think, is the response to your question, Jennifer, as to this balance between creating jobs locally and people moving to elsewhere. In the end, if you empower communities enough to allocate their resources to what they want, but also ensure that people have options, that as much as we want people to be rooted in their communities, a lot of people also want to leave, to go to somewhere else, even if it's for some time, and come back to their communities, or commute somewhere else to get better jobs. And it's that set of widening the range of options you give people, I think, that leads to improved livelihoods. In terms of practical solutions, just two thoughts. One is, we must never forget that the war hero Churchill was basically deposed by a relative unknown, Clem Attlee, 6 weeks after the end of the Second World War. Because it wasn't that this question of if we don't have the leaders, what do we do? In the democracies, you vote your leaders in and out of power. And Attlee was voted in. I mean, it's difficult to understand how, when Churchill was the absolute war hero at the pinnacle of his achievement, he was swept out of office by a landslide victory for Labour within 6 weeks. Now, that's because Churchill was not prepared to commit to the new world that people wanted, that Attlee committed to. The 5 ones, the welfare state, the international system. And I think we need to take inspiration from it. Let's not give up on national politics to help us change local things. And the final point, that this is really the time to rethink local. I'm struck by the data on the number of empty office buildings in Islington and Camden. You walk up and down the streets and see the shuttered up shops. We hear about the commitment to getting out of diesel and other things. This is the time for radical rethinking about space and what happens to these buildings, and whether they're going to become the places that we allow people to live in, and how we make real communities from the ground up, and how we get rid of the horrible traffic that we can't cross the road and that kills us through the pollution. And if ever there was a time I really believe this in our lifetime, Ian's much younger, so hopefully he'll get another chance to change the world in the future. But this, for anyone of my generation, is the only chance we're going to get for a better world to change, I believe. And that really puts the pressure on. And I think not only for our own generation's sake, but for future generations, if we don't rethink and reimagine the Knowledge Quarter, the whole of Camden, Islington, London, and the country at this point, it won't happen. And that sense of urgency, the changes that came in the Second World War didn't come after the war. You know, months and months after. They came during the war, and we need to remember that. Afterwards, we get complacent. We have the roaring 20s, and we'll be back to the 20s of a century ago, which was the start of a cycle, which has led to even worse crises.
Wonderful. I got tingles when you talked about Attlee, and yet there is room for hope. Athien, are there specific things that you think could happen right now that would make an immediate difference in the Knowledge Quarter?
I think it's all like a question of engagement. Like how are the Knowledge Quarter organizations providing opportunities for the young people in this area? Because I think we have these world-leading institutions in academics and leaders in the arts and software, but how are they actually providing and giving the knowledge that they have to young people in the area? Like literally, Google could run a program where they kind of support young people from some of the schools in the local area and teach them about computer programming. That's a skill of the future that they can literally do. That's not something that's kind of expansive or super difficult that they can do. And I think it's a question of, are these institutions working as actively as possible to do so? Because I think the change that we kind of pursue on a local level is what translates to a high level, and it's all about like accountability, but it's also about just being brave enough to look the prospect of the world not changing, of our efforts not being rewarded, of it kind of returning into the same thing that it was before, and still believing and having that hope that it can actually positively change. Because unless you kind of, I think there was a Cornel West quote that if you don't reckon with like despair, then there's no prospect of actually changing things. So I think that's something that I want to think about. But also I think we have to be critical about homogenizing young people, because there are young people just like everyone else in society. There are many different subsections. And it's how do we get young people who've been excluded from school involved in these kind of conversations? How do we get everyone in every different subsection to be involved in the conversation? But I think it's also just getting as many people as possible and engaging. Because I sometimes want to challenge this notion that anyone can singularly represent a group of people. Because I have some ideas, and there can be some other people in my area who totally disagree with them. And it's about how do we come together and have that conversation, and how can we all be involved in changing things. But on the final point that I'll make, and more broadly about that thing about Clement Attlee, is that one thing that you kind of, when you study history, is that there's a constant of complete and total unpredictability in the way that the world works. There was a point where kind of the empires who were dominant, I mean, like if you look at like colonialism, empire, slavery, these things weren't meant to end. Like there wasn't some kind of European moral epiphany and we're like, guys, you know what, let's pack up this massively profitable system of exploitation. It was like resistance in action. And so if those people can reshape the world in a massive way, then why can't we do the same?
Wonderful, thank you. We're going to carry on for a few more minutes, but Ian, I know, has to go. So Ian, thanks so much for your very valuable contribution, and we'll let you know how it goes. And I was just personally going to say, I so agreed with what you said, Athien, about, you know, how we define success. You know, somehow good and successful have become intermingled, but actually, you know, it hasn't always been the case. You know, if you even take the Bible, that the rich man is necessarily the good person. And yet in our society, we have come to equate those who accumulate most, whether it be wealth or status, as power, as being those who are desirable. And that's not how we live in our own homes. We care most about those we love and about connection and connectedness. So there is this huge disjunction between how we live our own lives and yet societally and culturally how we regard those with power and status, and feel compelled like lemmings to run towards the ever vanishing finish line. So, you know, I guess the one thing I would say is, you know, my favorite mantra is, how can I be helpful rather than harmful? How can I be of service? How can I look to what I can give rather than what I can get? And that's not in a hierarchical pity sense abuse of power, as Adam referred to earlier, which can happen with philanthropy. It's about the recognition that there, by the grace of God go I, that we are all of equal worth as human beings. We're whatever our circumstances, and that nothing we accumulate during this life changes that truth. We've had a couple of quick questions. Shall I try and do those now? Athyn, is there any role, if we don't like philanthropy, for charities? You talked about taxation being the justice, the most just.
Yeah, I think there are plenty of charities who do some really important and massively vital work and who are committed to solving specialist issues. But I think still we have to be critical about the structural role of society, of charity. As in, you can have a kind of individualized perspective where you look at this charity and say they do some amazing, brilliant work. But whenever we look at a charity, we have to think, what is the fundamental societal injustice that is requiring this charity to exist? Because it's kind of like charities do some really important and critical work. But if we look at the balance of power, okay, who's causing these issues that the charity is solving? Is it the economic structure, the people in power? And then you have this charity. Like this charity, even if they're well-intentioned and well-meaning and they're trying their best to solve these issues, it's a question, once again, of power. If we look at like the charities who work to kind of tackle issues of poverty, for example, in Africa, like, yeah, cool, they're kind of doing the work, but what about the nature of global trade? What about the imbalances in terms of the way that commodities are, the value of commodities are massively increased when they reach kind of more developed countries? Look, like you can't offset those fundamental balances through charity, and so we have to be quite critical about, because it's like what I think there was a kind of school of post-colonial African thinkers and intellectuals and leaders who kind of rejected the aid and said that it basically was a source of interdependence, and that actually African autonomy is about developing independently and building up their own kind of economic structures rather than just charity. So I think we have to be, whenever we're looking at charity, we have to be critical about what are the fundamental drivers of the need for this charity to exist in the first place.
Fantastic, thank you. And just very quickly, Adam, I'll give the last question to you, which is, should we be looking towards a more federal situation? And how would we avoid that creating a competitive environment with a race to the bottom for some towns and regions?
Well, no, I'm not very keen on a sort of federal arrangement for England anyway. I mean, the UK is a separate point, but if we're just talking about England, a federal system implies setting up sort of new regional assemblies and all that. And, you know, I think it's very clear no one wants new tiers of politicians and political decision making. We have perfectly good, highly professional, democratically elected political organizations all across the country called local councils. Let's devolve powers to them. We don't need to create a whole new tier. There are all sorts of issues about how we encourage regional collaboration, but, you know, devolution to those councils as a starting point is absolutely key. I mean, in terms of how we prevent a race to the bottom or greater inequality, as sort of Ian raised as a concern, I think we've got to keep in mind here that the UK, England, one of the most centralized countries in Europe, and also one of the most economically unequal and regionally unequal. Centralization is not a condition for equality. Equally, a country like Denmark, one of the most equal countries in the world, also highly decentralized, where local government actually has a role recognized in the constitution. They have, you know, certain rights and responsibilities which no central government can take away from them. So, you know, you can set ceilings, you can set floors, you can set the framework within which local areas and local communities can work to make sure that we don't end up with a massive race to the bottom. Absolutely agree with that. But they should be the big strategic framework. The key decisions about how you address a local community's challenges should be taken by that local community. And for me, that's just a matter of basic democratic rights before you even get onto economics.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have run out of time now. Sarah, Adam, Athyn, thank you so much for your incredibly exciting and inspiring contributions. And I think we've got a little bit of an action plan here, a little bit of a manifesto. So I hope very much that some of the ideas that have been discussed here will be taken forward. Thanks again for your time and for everyone who stopped by to listen in.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for chairing that. And thank you to all of our speakers, Professor Ian Golding, Sarah McKinley, Adam Lent, and Athian, for your keynote and also for staying on for this panel. Absolutely. If you haven't heard a lightning talk before, let me tell you, they're brilliant. Each speaker has prepared 20 visual slides that will be shown for 21 seconds each on an automatic timer. Neither the speaker nor I have control to stop those slides. So once they're started, they're started. I'll introduce the speakers one at a time, and then they'll present their lightning talk. Okay, so first of all, we've got Madeline Goodall, the Heritage Coordinator at Humanists UK. This year, Humanists UK is celebrating its 125th anniversary. And since 2019, Madeline has been researching the history and influence of the organization and its members since its founding in 1896 as the Union of Ethical Societies, and the building the Humanist Heritage website to share this little known heritage. Madeline is also Humanists UK's Wikimedian in residence, advocating for the improvement and diversification of Wikipedia. She's going to be telling us a story about an app that they've created during the lockdown. Over to you, Madeline.
So I'm going to talk about a collaboration between Humanists UK, a charity representing the non-religious, 125 years old this year, and Go Jauntly, which is an app that focuses on making walking accessible and enjoyable, particularly for city dwellers. This happened as part of the Humanist Heritage Project, which was launched in 2019. As Bav mentioned. So we were founded in 1896 as the Union of Ethical Societies, groups of individuals who sought to live good lives without reference to ideas of God or an afterlife. And the focus was on deed, not creed. So unsurprisingly, perhaps, members were very active in a wide range of reforms. Among the project's key discoveries were many hidden women and other underrepresented histories. We uncovered formerly overlooked individuals who were actually founding figures of the organisation, like school teacher and honorary secretary Nellie Freeman, suffragist Lily Boileau, socialist feminist Zona Valence, and tireless divorce law campaigner Macy Tiedemann. The project was always intended to have a geographical emphasis, challenging the idea that a lack of churches, temples, or places of worship means a dearth of physical heritage for the non-religious. This is the map from the website as it is today, but this was a long way from being launched last year. So a key part of sharing these places and spaces ahead of website launch was always a plan for lead walks taking place throughout 2020 and 2021, including led by experts like the brilliant David Rosenberg, whose No Gods, No Masters walk on Bloomsbury's radical history takes in some of these sites. This is Conway Hall pictured here. But as everyone knows, 2020 brought 2 national lockdowns and a pivot from in-person events to alternative models of sharing research and learning and working together. So in light of this, our planned collaboration with Go Jauntly took on a new significance, allowing us to build an in-app walk, which could be self-led and didn't even require people to physically walk it until it would be safe. Much like a sonnet or indeed a lightning talk, the format requires the shepherding of your thoughts and information. The route of the walk and the contents have to work together in a logical, engaging way. How do you, for example, convey the many crossovers between members of the ethical societies and various aspects of social reform if you haven't explained what an ethical society is? Because of its rich humanist and radical history, Bloomsbury, kind of a natural choice for the first in-app walk. It's the home of UCL, founded as a secular alternative to Oxford and Cambridge, and Conway Hall, home of the Humanist Library today. It also has plaques for, among others, the Women's Freedom League, Virginia Woolf, social reformer and secularist George Jacob Holyoake, and Indian social reformer Ramahan Roy, and they've all disappeared now. We actually launched the Humanist Bloomsbury Tour at the exact moment of the second national lockdown, November 2020, so it was important to emphasise that the walk could be previewed, saved and walked later. We hope to bring new resonance to familiar streets and sites for local people, especially with lockdown walks being many people's only daily exercise. So here's the map overview and some opening views of the walk. This combination of map, image and read more panels lent itself really well to the sheer amount of history contained in Bloomsbury streets. You can preview the steps before the walk, refer to them during and revisit them afterwards. And it enabled us to share findings which might otherwise be deemed quite niche. So relating to the history of humanism and Humanists UK, here are two, again, suffragists and members formerly of Humanists UK, as it was. It allowed us, importantly, to emphasise the physical closeness and surprising connections between various Knowledge Quarter organisations. It also meant we could use items from the collections of those organisations to add visual richness to the walk, like the remarkable Creative Commons licensed and public domain images in the Wellcome collection, and that Bentham engraving was one of theirs. And it also allowed us to give glimpses into our own archive, which is held by the Bishopsgate Institute. This is from the George Jacob Holyoake archive, in fact, at the Bishopsgate, his 1842 arrest warrant for blasphemy. And where a single site contained echoes across time, it meant we could highlight connections and crossovers that took place on those sites. So, for example, Brunswick Square, which links the eloquent agnostics Leslie and Julia Stephen, their daughter Virginia Woolf, and the writer and civil rights activist E.M. Forster. You can also look inside buildings, which are no longer there, or which are still there, but used for the same purpose, such as the Church of Humanity, now on Rugby Street. The religion of humanity was a secular religion invented by Auguste Comte to celebrate the achievements of humankind rather than worship a supernatural being. And in this case, it allowed us to introduce Harriet Martineau, who translated Comte's works into English, Darwin's bulldog, as he was known, T.H. Huxley, who hated positivism, George Eliot, who was very influenced by it, and Rabindranath Tagore and John Stuart Mill, who were both insightful critics and adapters of positivist ideas. So as well as helping to demonstrate the physical proximity of the Knowledge Quarter's institutions, it also allowed us to situate them within a wider community and network of knowledge and change, which was both historical and contemporary. Go Jauntly have also incorporated wellbeing research into the app, following a partnership of theirs with the Nature Connectedness Research Group at the University of Derby. This had proved the beneficial impact of noticing urban nature on mental health. So Nature Notes, encouraging just this, was introduced as a feature, and perhaps takes on even more significance in the wake of the pandemic and the importance of being able to be outside safely. And we are planning to go outside of the Knowledge Quarter. We're currently finishing off a Manchester walk with Go Jauntly, and we'll also produce equivalents for various cities and towns across the UK, where we'll draw on regionally specific history and local museum and archive collections. For many Knowledge Quarter organisations, this could be a means of similarly sharing research, showing off collections, building partnerships, not just with each other, but also with the local community. Could be explored in terms of how members of the community could be engaged in the process of researching, creating and trialling walks themselves, emphasising collaboration, connection, common histories and learning from each other, perhaps empowering people to tell their own stories and share their own personal geographies. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Madeline. Our next lightning talk is by Matthew Barbar, who is the consultant for research and data visualization for the Kitab team at the Aga Khan University. Matthew recently completed his doctorate in medieval Islamic history at the University of Edinburgh on the subject of history writing in Egypt in the medieval period. He works with the Kitab team at the Aga Khan University. In particular, Matthew works with the team to help develop visualizations for their multiple complex data sets. He's interested in digital reading environments and the way that they can be used to improve the accessibility of primary sources and historical research. He's going to be sharing a story of some of the work that they've been doing recently. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. So thank you for allowing us to speak at the conference today. I'm going to talk to you today about the Kitab team. We work in the digital humanities, mostly with medieval texts written in Arabic. And our main aim is to use digital methods to understand medieval Arabic book history. The work discussed here, though, is not just that of the team, not just that of mine, it's the team. And we're a combination of historians and a technical team, including computer scientists specializing in natural language processing. Together, we're working to improve digital methods, create a digital corpus, and develop new ways of understanding data, such as through visualization. And I'm a historian working with the team on problems of visualization. Now, first to start with a definition, digital humanities can encompass many things. On the whole, we work on reading texts in new ways using digital techniques. Digital techniques help us zoom out and contextualize our reading. So we are actually reading the text, but we're also zooming out and looking at them in context to allow us to see texts in ways that we otherwise couldn't. But today I want to show you how we could use digital humanities to disseminate our texts, especially outside of the academic realm. And one of the main things we research is text reuse. Pre-modern texts share lots of material. Authors often commonly borrow and adapt from their predecessors. And so it's essential to understand text reuse if we're going to understand how Arabic books were written. We use an algorithm called PASSIM, which compares every single text in our corpus to every other text in our corpus and identifies passages that are similar between those texts. For each of those texts, it creates a file listing those passages and their locations. Our current corpus produces 1.5 million such files, and the largest file has over 31,000 rows. That's over 31,000 instances of reuse. For a medievalist, this is big data, and it clearly indicates something important is going on with our tradition. It's, however, a lot of data to comprehend, and so we have different visualizations to try and understand it. Some visualizations let us see how passages are rearranged between texts. So in both of these visualizations, you can see the book being represented by a band with 0 meaning the start of the book, and the lines show how pieces of that book are reused in other books in the corpus. The data can also help us understand dissemination. In this visualization, we can see how different parts of one book, A Famous History by At-Tabari, are shared in a variety of different texts. Each color represents a different book, and so you can see how there are bands here. Different parts of At-Tabari's history is being reused by very specific historians. You might ask in the two visualizations I've just shown you, though, where did the text actually go? After all, the books are our objects of study, and the data that we produce is meaningless without the text themselves. And I believe that using interactive digital reading interfaces can help link this data directly back to the text that we study. And this will not only help researchers like me, but it will also help the public understand the text that we work with. In my experience, reading has moved little from the printed text in the digital realm. E-readers give us some sort of flexibility, so you can change the font size or the margin size, for example, but they offer very little in the realm of interactivity. You might be able to perform some searches or annotation, but there's very little on top of that. And I think we can do much more. Last year, in partnership with the Qatar National Library, the Kitab team built a prototype interactive digital reading environment. This linked our data directly with the text from which that data was derived. In this image, for example, we can see quotations from a specific text found through digital methods highlighted in grey in the texts. And it allowed us in particular to start seeing text reuse data alongside our texts. Here you can see two books that are reusing material side by side in the reader. And then on the right panel, we have the text that's being reused highlighted in green. Now, this is just a prototype, really, but I think we can do much, much more with this technology. In some ways, perhaps ironically, I think that reading digitally actually brings us closer to how our texts were originally written and read. For example, some of the text reuse identified by our algorithm would have been much more recognizable as quotation to the contemporaries who were reading the text, who often read these texts in groups or were taught these texts, as you can see in the image that I've put on the slide there. And this is now lost to us reading in our modern context, and the reader helps bring that back. But most importantly, I think the future of interactive digital reading is to help make texts more accessible. The texts that Kitab works with are part of a living tradition that still means much to Arabic and non-Arabic speakers today. Modern book markets and libraries, especially the online library Shamila, are testament to the continued importance of those medieval texts. Digital humanities data could help make these often very complex texts much more accessible. For example, we could use text reuse data to show how different but less complex passages of text are shared between works and help people who are read the same passage but in a less complex form. And the utility is particularly visible when we look at methods that use natural language processing. By natural language processing, I mean techniques where a computer automatically identifies features within a text, often using machine learning to find in a way that could not be done possible manually. So finding lots and lots of things which we couldn't do through manual tagging. So it could be, for example, used to identify named entities like names of people or places. The difficulty is that most work in natural language processing has been done on modern Arabic. The Kitab team are working with computer scientists to improve the models to work for classical texts. And our tests have found that some of the modern models often do quite well for finding names in certain contexts, but then sometimes it splits names in half. And this is because it's used to seeing modern text, not classical text, where the rules of names are slightly different. Advances in these fields could really help our accessibility of text to the broader public. Imagine being able to provide links to Wikipedia for place names in a text that contains literally thousands of place names. Or perhaps linking the names of people between different texts so that people can read about the same person in different contexts. These texts are primarily often read by people whose first language is not Arabic, or they're often used for teaching Arabic. And we could, in Interactive Reader, provide language tools. The reader could highlight citations, for example. These are often long lists of names in Arabic text, and they're not very useful to a learner. Or we might imagine automatically getting synonyms for words, or even providing automatic simplification of a text. For complex texts like these, such features could broaden accessibility as well as be useful for research. This would allow hundreds of thousands of people access to an important literary heritage in a way never before possible. But to do this, we need to continue collaborating, improving methods and developing, crucially collaborating between historians and computer scientists in this endeavor. And Kitab is proud to be part of that process. If you have any questions, advice, or ideas based on what I've spoken to you about today, I'd love to hear from you. We love to collaborate, as I've just been saying, so please get in touch on the email on the slide. And if anything that I spoke about today has really interested you, I recommend that you visit our website, where we've got lots of blogs talking about the work that we've been doing over the last few years. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Matthew. Really interesting stuff there. Our third lightning talk is by Caroline Wilson, who's the Director of Inclusive Economy and Jobs at Islington Council. She has been with the council for nearly 3 years, leading its pioneering economic development program. It focuses on jobs for local people and building wealth at a community level through its progressive business support, procurement, and asset management approaches. Previously, Caroline worked in Belfast City Council for over 15 years, where she led on major regeneration and business improvement programs, brokering political and community deals, resulting in £150 million worth of investment in local neighbourhoods. Caroline, we're looking forward to your lightning talk. It'll start as soon as the slide changes. Over to you.
Cheers, Bob. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation this afternoon. I'm really pleased to speak on behalf of Islington. So Islington has a kind of world image as being kind of bright lights and a place of great wealth. We have 21,000 small businesses. We have world-class business clusters, Knowledge Quarter obviously being at the heart of that. We have some of the wealthiest people in the country, but we also have some deep, deep inequalities and extremes of rich and poor. In 2011, we did a fairness commission to really look at kind of what are the structural barriers in our community and society to really try to unpack some of those. And looking at things like land values, employment, child poverty, and so on. It won't surprise you to know that we have a great range of deprivation in the borough. And most of this is interestingly above the London average. So Finsbury Park there on the left-hand side has the highest level, and all but one have a higher level than the London average. And this has only got worse. Nearly 1/3 of children live in families where they are facing income deprivation. We're consistently one of the highest in the country, which is really surprising, as I did come from Belfast to find this out in a place like Islington. Also, you have 34% of older people who are also facing income deprivation, and this has impacts around fuel poverty and so on. All of these vulnerabilities were true before the pandemic. They're even truer now after the pandemic. And we have now highly qualified people who are unemployed in the borough, and this is making the queue longer for people who are looking for work in Islington. And we have particular sectors that have been hardest hit. And we really need to understand what we mean by build back better. And we don't mean same old, same old. We absolutely want to look at the precarious nature of our economy and how we can make sure that we can make it as secure and as resilient and sustainable as possible as we go into the future. So we think that means a radical approach to building back better. We think this is about tilting the playing field and not leveling the playing field. We really want to look at the issues around social justice and to really help those who need help the most in our communities. It's about looking at the foundations of our economy. people who work in transport, in hospitality, in the care sector, in retail, people who really kept our country moving wherever we face the crisis. Wealth locally is always built in partnerships, and we are looking around to see who the partnerships are that we can work with. And we very much are focusing on anchor institutions in Islington and really looking at how we together can build back better, because a lot of them are already doing really fantastic work. So what is an anchor institution then? Traditionally, they're large organisations, but in Islington, we're looking at a whole plethora of organisations, so large and small, private and public. They tend to have these 5 characteristics, but very focused on the local place. They are really place-based anchors and who do a lot in our communities. Some of the thinking of this comes from the Democracy Collaborative, so you've heard from Sarah earlier, but people like Claes and Manchester have done amazing work, Preston, and I would really highly recommend the JRF Leeds case study, which really kind of understands what the different aspects of that anchor institution framework could be. We are saying that we have a new emerging framework, but it'll mean different things to different organisations, and it's not that we expect every organisation to contribute to all of the elements that we're looking at, but it's really about kind of setting out a common purpose and a common direction of travel for all of us in Islington. So firstly, as an employer, what are our big organisations and our smaller organisations doing in terms of being good employers? And how do they inspire the next generation? How do they make sure their jobs are accessible? And what are good jobs? Are they paying well? Are they recruiting locally? And one example of this is recently we've just announced that Islington has become a London living wage place, and we're the first borough north of the river to do that. And we're really proud of working with 17 organisations to really make this a reality for people in the borough. Next, we are looking, the second element of the anchor institution is really looking at us as purchasers. So the council in Islington, for instance, spends about 650 million with over 6,000 organisations. So is there a way that we can work with others to bend some of that spend to benefit local communities and local businesses? And are there things that we can do around the net zero agenda, for instance? Are there ways that we can use local suppliers? So recently we commissioned Outlandish, who are our affordable workspace cooperative in the north of the borough, to support local businesses who wanted to digitise their business. So small independent traders who really didn't know how to get online, and Outlandish were able to do a series of webinars and practical workshops with them. Thirdly is around landlord. How, as a landlord, an anchor institution is operating in the borough. So are they making their places open and accessible? What are they doing in terms of zero carbon agenda? What social value are they bringing to communities? Are these places that communities feel welcome into? So one of the things that we've just set up recently and opened last week is with City University as a new affordable workspace on the Farringdon Road. This will look at social enterprises and really be a catalyst for small community businesses within the borough, making lots of new jobs and inspiring a new generation of social entrepreneurs. The final one is about being a leader as an anchor institution. So what's the culture and what are the behaviours of an anchor institution? What are they doing in regards really important matters like Black Lives Matters? What are they saying about net zero? And are there kind of influences that they can bring to bear within their networks as well? So for instance, one of the great projects that we worked on with the Institute of Physics was at a town centre level to inspire young people around stargazing. So we had hundreds of young people looking at the stars in Archway a couple of years ago now, before COVID obviously. And it was a fantastic event to really show how we could collectively work towards a fairer Islington. So all of this is about working collaboratively and finding the advantage of working together. We're doing lots of great things in isolation from each other. So how can we work together more closely to really build a fairer Islington after the pandemic? Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was absolutely brilliant, absolutely fascinating. And there's loads of them that we can listen to and unpick later on. So thank you for your time, Caroline. Now, our final lightning talk Sadly, Jane Widdiford couldn't be with us in person because of some commitment, but we recorded the session a little bit earlier. So Jane Widdiford is from Global Generation. She's the co-founder. She co-founded Global Generation in 2004. She has more than 25 years of experience in delivering environmental, arts, and vocational training projects in New Zealand and in the UK. She managed a city farm for Framework Trust and developed an inner city forest in Auckland as a learning resource for the Department of Education, set up and ran the NVQ horticulture program for Camden Job Train, and coordinated Camden's environmental education network. She's also managed Rise Phoenix, a community arts organization that worked with children and young people in the war-torn areas of the Balkans, in Tanzania, and in London. Now, Global Generation manage the Story Garden, and I hope most of you have had a chance to visit the Story Garden. Certainly if you are residents of the Knowledge Quarter, then you should have seen it. It's the big garden that's between the British Library and the Francis Crick Institute. I urge you to go and visit. Jane's talk is called Voices of the Earth, Stories of Species on the Edge. And here's her talk.
Imagine you are sitting in a circle of 50 small oaks grown from the acorns of 7,000 oaks planted by Joseph Beuys in Germany. This is where our Voices of the Earth journey began, into the healing power of plants, in the heart of an oak forest in the middle of the Story Garden in King's Cross. The oaks silently spoke to us, encouraging us to go slow. They reminded us to create space for open-mindedness, a space beyond barriers and prejudice. Mothers brought stories handed down through generations, and young people shared through words, drawing, movement, and music, their experience of spending time with plants. At the start of our journey, one of our young fellows, Maida, described how she was astonished at how little she and her contemporaries knew about the healing power of plants compared to people in the past or people in other parts of the world. At the end of the journey, Sion said, something like a daisy or big like an oak tree can have a much greater impact on us than I realized. The plants, stories, and songs that I encountered over the last year will be with me forever. Thanks to the British Library, young people explored books from hundreds of years ago. They commented on the care and detail in the way the plants were drawn. It was as if they were friends who could help us survive. In the Royal College of Physicians Garden, we learnt of folk remedies and scientific healings, and in their own ways, our participants found ways to marry the mythic and the scientific understandings of the world. In the early days of the pandemic, when the institutions closed their doors, our job was to help people come outdoors, away from their computers, into the wide green spaces and the tiny mysterious cracks in the pavements where dandelion, nettle, and fireweed find their way through. The project gave me a reason to leave my bedroom and go outside, said Cassie. Feeling the sun on my face, being in nature made me feel connected, even if I was physically distanced from others. Discussion and creative writing provided opportunities for people to find words for unfamiliar experiences and to share fears about the lived realities of each day. Our life has changed, waking up to something new that has never happened before, numbers to read every day on cases and deaths, and I'm scared. We sang songs and made teas and balms. We learnt about marigolds, orange and bright, who heal our skin and make us right. I learnt about the big story time has, said Samira. Time helps children sleep better, and time you healed the Mondini women's bodies who worked in the fields during the time of Italian fascism, and now you tell a story of happiness and community as we plant you in this garden. Maida explained how Theatre Complicité taught us to animate meanings and work together as a team. The bamboo took on a life of its own, helping us weave our way into the depths of the stories, illuminating different meanings for each of us. My heart skipped a beat when I heard from Dante, a fellow. He told of the story of Yggdrasil, the world tree that ties us all together. When the ash tree dies, this universal order will wither away. I was standing by the hardy tree in St. Pancras Gardens, now suffering from ash dieback. Eben explored sugarcane. It was a way of expressing his culture and his history. He connected his contributions to something that will make people think and appreciate and remember that Black lives do matter. We recorded audio pieces with Dan Balfour of Theatre Complicité. As Cassie said, I was fortunate enough to record the story of Yarrow and Achille, which is heavily linked to Greek mythology. It made me realize that all plants have stories behind their names. Hearing the audios made me feel proud of myself as a young person, proud of my generation who can still do positive things. I thought how far we've come as a group with our creative expression and our sharing of ideas. We produced a book that's now on sale on the British Library website and a photography exhibition, which you can come and see in the Story Garden. We now have images and words from young people about their experience of plants threaded all through the garden. Exchanging stories is an age-old way of communities coming together and making meaning. Storytelling is an imaginative endeavor that meets the needs of our time. Do come and visit us in the Story Garden, and we would love to hear how the stories of the earth are shaped and shared by you.
Fantastic. It's wonderful to hear the story from Jane. And if you haven't seen the book yet, I do urge you to go and get it. It's absolutely brilliant. A massive thank you to all of our Lightning Talk speakers from this session. So Madeline Goodall, Matthew Barber, Caroline Wilson, and Jane Rudiford. Now we're coming towards the final leg of today's session, but a lot of people have been asking, we haven't been able to see all of it, we haven't been able to take part for all 3 days. Could we see this online a bit later? I'm absolutely pleased to inform you that we will be putting up all of these sessions for the last 3 days up on our Knowledge Quarter YouTube page next week. So look out for a message or a newsletter that will inform you about that with all the links as well. So hopefully if you've missed any part of the keynote speeches, the panel discussions, or the lightning talks, you'll be able to watch them next week. Now, as I said to you before, while the lightning talks are going on, a group of students from Haverstock School have been having their own roundtable discussing the theme of the day. They have been doing a week of virtual work experience organized by Regent's Place. So a massive big thank you to Rose Alexander, the community manager at Regent's Place, for organizing everything, and for the moderator of the group, Lewis Howell. He's going to be joining us in a minute. We're also going to be joined by a poet who's going to share a chronicle, a poetic chronicle of the day, of the main points that were mentioned this morning by Athi and Akek, and by the panel who discussed the future of growing together. Hey, how's it going?
Bav? How you doing?
Very good. Tell us about how the day's been. How, in fact, all week you've been doing this work experience thing.
I
With
know.
stuff.
And that's why I've only just jumped in now. We literally, the conversation was riveting. We just finished speaking about everything we saw at the conference today. And they were so vocal. I was like, guys, I have to jump in the conference in 60 seconds. So please, I'm so sorry, but I got to jump in there. But
Fantastic.
no, the work experience.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to you. Share us the main points that were spoken today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to answer your first question regarding, sort of what we've been doing this week, it's been amazing. So, Regent's Place, which is one of British Land's locations, just located across the road pretty much from Great Portland Street, pretty much in the Euston area. They often do put on work experience opportunities for local young people. And the young people we've been working with this week are actually some sixth formers that go to Haverstock School in Camden. And it's been an amazing experience for them from what they share with me anyway. I don't want to be saying that as if to say that's me saying it on their behalf. But the reason they share it's been a great experience on the virtual work experience this week is because they've really had an opportunity to understand the genuine, not only challenges, but opportunities that they could experience when working with an organization like British Land via Regent's Place. Because I set them a task this week of imagine that Regent's Place are struggling to engage with young people aged 12 to 18 from the local area to take on board some of the opportunities and offers that may be available to young people like that. What would you do if you had the opportunity to develop a marketing campaign strategy that would better engage that audience of people? So all week they've been going through different workshops, webinars, bringing together their own thoughts, strategies, ideas. They've been hearing from guests who are also from other companies that serve the local community or are based in and around the area to be able to build on that. And they're going to actually be bringing together a final presentation tomorrow. But today, when we were, listening to the conference, it was very interesting because as soon as I asked just an open question of, how did you find that? Well, the first thing that all of them said is, yeah, do you know what? When a lot of the speakers were speaking about the importance of being able to devolve power and really ensure that power doesn't necessarily just sit in the political spaces by those who are in Westminster, and actually thinking about how do grassroots initiatives and people from local communities go about having more influence, and more power over the way in which certain decisions are made that are going to directly affect their lives. That was the first thing they were exploring. And they actually turned around and said things like, we as young people don't necessarily even feel like we have that much power, which is always interesting because you then start to consider, is that them not feeling that they have that much power based on genuinely feeling powerless or not just necessarily being aware of the ways in which they can go about being more empowered? So we started to go down that line of conversation, even down to things like, I was saying to them that, there are a lot of organizations that are watching that conference and are saying, in terms of trying to tackle inequality, especially if you use the catalyst of seeing more engagement with the Black Lives Matter movement last year than we've seen in history, because the Black Lives Matter movement was around a long time before last year, as we know. Considering that, we've seen a lot more organizations, companies, especially those in and around the Knowledge Quarter, who would turn around and say, we've been doing a lot, actually. I was saying to them, if I was to play devil's advocate, I might be sitting there as a company and saying, no, we've been doing things. And so the young people said, well, then is it a case of there needs to be a way for the work that they are doing to therefore be better shared with young people so they are more informed about the work that some of these organizations and companies are doing, so that way they can better understand the journey that they are going on to try and tackle inequality, so that way not only are they informed, but they can maybe also support. They can maybe also have their voices elevated and raised. So that was very interesting. We then also were able to pick up on some of the points that were made, especially during the panel session, regarding what I personally just classified as cooperation, to try and make it as easy as possible for them to understand, but really starting to explore some of those points around how do we go about ensuring that within any organization, decision-making doesn't necessarily just sit with those that have majority shareholding. And that was a really interesting conversation because I think for a number of them, they were able to quickly make the connection between the fact that if we go about having a more cooperative approach to business and the way in which organizations are run, you probably would get a better representation of what it is that local communities see as priorities to them if we could start to use cooperation more effectively within a number of organizations, which was brilliant. But then where our conversation was really starting to warm up, and I was saying to some guys, look, we spent a little while on it, but I have to go in just a moment, was when we were starting to really consider the role of CSR and the fact that, you know, even though they didn't necessarily understand fully what CSR was when we started the conversation, once we were able to break it down and then really start to have that conversation in more detail, what was interesting is they were able to appreciate that actually there's a lot of ways in which not only has CSR got to be something seen as something that has to be done, but actually, if we could best articulate the benefits to both the beneficiaries of CSR initiatives, but also to those who are supposed to be supporting CSR initiatives from within organizations, there are some better ways to be able to go about making decisions about the way CSR initiatives are run so that everybody can win, everybody can benefit. Because they've been looking at everything this week from just a marketing standpoint. And there is an argument to be made that effective CSR does still have that return on investment for an organization who does it in a way where they genuinely empower those that are supposed to be seen as their beneficiaries. So there was a lot within the conversation, but I've tried to distill it down to those three main things that we were able to talk about.
Fantastic. That's a lot there. And I'm really impressed, Lewis, that you were able to, in a very short time, get the group to discuss those points. I didn't introduce you properly. I was so excited and I wanted to hear.
Sorry, I got excited as well.
You got excited as well. So I'm going to introduce you because I think I want everyone to know who you are. I think you're an amazing person. So you began your journey as a young, aspiring footballer from Lewisham. This is brilliant. You didn't necessarily embrace your natural gift of being able to move, motivate, and inspire people that you came into contact with. But during school and college, it was very much get to work and do your best. But really, football was first. I bet you were happy with the score last night and where we're going. It's fantastic.
Amazing to see.
Now, while you're studying at university, two flames were lit for you, Lewis. The first was a love for entrepreneurialism and business. And as you began to attend a number of business and enterprise programs, as well as to make yourself known in the young entrepreneur scene in England. The second flame was for youth and community empowerment. You began volunteering, championing, and working with a number of organizations that focused on the area. Years later, we can see a man that's confident and consistent. You embrace responsibility to support the growth of startups and small businesses while pouring into a varied range of communities that can benefit from your passion, your expertise, in order to become more empowered and cohesive. I know you work very closely with Regent's Place, British Land, and we hope that the Knowledge Quarter that we can work with you a lot more in the future as well. But thank you for taking out time today for sharing the thoughts of the young people. Please thank them for us. We can't see them, but please thank them all for us. And we look forward to seeing you again, Lewis. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Bav. Great event today.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Now, as promised, we've got a wonderful roundup of today in a poetic chronicle. Ruqayyah Fatuga is a poet, a facilitator, and an events producer based in London. Her work joins conversations on overlapping identities, faith, and culture as self-affirmation. Ruqayyah's commissions include work for the BBC, for Apple, Bloomberg Philanthropies with Vanity Fair, English touring theatre, and with LinkedIn. Since winning the Roundhouse Poetry Slam, Ruqayyah is developing her monodrama, Unbraided, to show at the Roundhouse Last Word Festival in July of this year. Ruqayyah, it's so wonderful to have you. I'm looking forward to hearing your poetic chronicle of the day. Over to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Bav. It's been wonderful listening to all of the talks today, and I've been scribbling down a little poetic piece for you all. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. The poem doesn't have a name yet, but thank you everyone who's been here today, presenting, speaking, and sharing your incredible ideas. If revolution is governed by mysterious laws of its own, maybe we should give in to everything we don't yet know, to listen to the rhythm of a change that's going to come, to the echo of lessons from resistance that was won. We dance through ideas, we yacht club swing into a quarter of rich culture that is ever changing. Communities disappearing like shop signs, boarded over and emptied. Marginalized communities told what they want without being asked what they need. But there is energy here, an impatient youth campaigning for the climate and for equality. Fanon speaks through an incisive teen with his Afro pick. Each generation must discover its mission. So what is the mission at hand? If crisis costs those who have the least the most, how do we distribute power so no potential is left untapped? So every Raheem in our area has the sterling in his pocket to give him a fighting chance. So everyone has the support to show how much they can offer. We dance through ideas. We yacht club swing through Haverstock School, humanist walks, Arabic literature, and Islington council talks, thinking about tilting the playing field and devolving power. Can this pandemic shake us into refresh? Could all this lead to a better world where we take time to look around us and see the economically marginalized and the politically marginalized are the same? Don't we all deserve support? Camden is a flagship for solidarity, even without obvious commonality. This final day of knowledge swapping is a fresh start. Each of us leaves with an armful of questions like fireflies waiting to spring into action. How can I be helpful rather than harmful? How is knowledge shared with everyone around? How do we find the compassion to switch? How do we find the compassion switch to light up this quarter of London? Small changes that collect and glow, lighting the streets and all of our homes. We've seen the world radically change. Why can't we all do the same? Thank you.
Wow, Ruqayyah, that was so powerful, so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. I know to sit and listen to 2.5 hours of conversation is not easy, but you've captured it so beautifully, and we look forward to sharing your poem with all the people who attended this conference, but more so with the people who weren't able to attend, and hopefully they can listen to your poem or read your poem and get a gist of what was discussed today. Thanks so much, Ruqayyah.
Thank you.
So finally, we've come to the end of this session. This year's conference, rather than doing it over one day at a venue, because of the pandemic, we've had to do it virtually, and we decided to split it over 3 days, 3 afternoons of keynotes and conversations and inspiring talks. But one thing that has remained consistent is our wonderful the support from our wonderful sponsor, the principal sponsor of the conference this year, and the one from 2019 and the one from 2018 is British Land. Without their support, not just financially, but also morally, we wouldn't be able to do events and programs like this. So a really big thanks to British Land. I'm going to invite Juliet Morgan from British Land to give us the vote of thanks. Before that, I'll just introduce, I know, Juliet, you don't like things like this, but I'm obliged to. It's my responsibility to introduce you formally. So you've worked in the property sector for 15 years. Juliet has specialized in the technology and biotech sectors, working internationally to deploy co-working spaces, pop-up investment suites, and censored social spaces. And you were the founder member of Tech City UK, the UK government. You joined British Land in 2017 to lead the strategic asset management of Regent's Place, which is one of your 3 lifestyle campuses in London. And most recently, Juliet, you were the London lead for Cushman and Wakefield's global technology practice, where you led the development of Pi Labs, Europe's first prop tech accelerator. Juliet, thanks so much for joining and saying the final words of the conference for us.
Gosh, it's always an honor to be here and amongst Knowledge Quarter, and just listening to all that made me suddenly feel very old. It's totally impossible to follow Ruqayyah or indeed any of the amazing speakers for the last 3 days. So really, I have the privilege of thanking everyone, and just a moment of reflection, if you'll indulge me for a second. It goes without saying that we've had an extraordinary 16 months, and to a great extent, it's taught us to value where we are and what we have and who we have around us. And more than that, to look after each other and to really think about the importance of investing in science. And so this area is so important. It's important to British Land, it's important to the UK, but it always strikes me with these Knowledge Quarter conferences just how extraordinary it really is. From the people who grow the plants that we've seen to the poets, the word that keeps coming to my mind is diversity: ethnic, social, economic, thought diversity, political diversity, space diversity. And what I want to leave you with is a sense that it's not just amazing for London, it's an amazing circular mile in a global context too. And the reason why is the things it shares with other Knowledge Quarters. is that commitment to science and progress. But what separates this one is that sense of inquiry and respect and curiosity, but more importantly, it's neighbourliness. It's pursuit of excellence and diversity and strength in whatever anybody's doing. So what I want to say is that this place is different because of the ethos and the culture, and that is created by every one of you. So for those of you who don't know British Land, we are privileged to be part of the community of owners and developers that sit across the circular mile. We're honoured to create infrastructure and the places that some of you live out your lives, and we share that responsibility and opportunity with others: Argent, Lendlease, British Library, Mitsui, Stanhope, Derwent, UCL. And what I want to say about that is that it's not just us. There's plenty here investing in the spaces and platforms that you're doing this great work on and in and conducting those great lives. So we're not people who can create vaccines, but we have got a 30-year track record of investing in this area and the people in the place, including, as Bav said, the opportunity to support Knowledge Quarter. And we won't be stopping that now or anytime soon. If anything, it'll be more investment led by an incredible team up at Regent's Place. And we have a community manager there, Rose Alexander, who's beautiful inside and out, and Paul Jaffe, who studied sustainability. And really that's about building and continuing to build on a place which is about opportunity and somewhere that we can all be proud of. So I just want to wrap up by covering a little bit about day one, discussed work and the future of work and its potential. And what strikes me so vividly is the diversity of experience that people have had access to, opportunities, but also some people have been really stuck at home and not had places to go. And so it's an opportunity and a responsibility for all those property developers to create spaces, not just for those who are paying, but for everyone in between, the fabric of the city, if you like. Day two talked about education and learning and childhood, experiences and environments, early years, higher education, health, ability and other ability in bodies, and student experiences. And it just brought me back to this idea that futures get written in the Knowledge Quarter district. And sometimes we forget about those shorter than us who are just starting out on their journeys. On day three, it's been about the Knowledge Quarter's role in the social economy, the distribution of power and the economics of local growth, how there's different diversity around generational power and access to power. The lightning talk's just incredible. We've gone from poetry and vaccinations to dance, to careers, education, and community employment. And this word diversity keeps coming back, the diversity of voices, the veterinarians, the dancers, the directors, the educators, the poets, the politicians, the growers. This place is strong because it's diverse, it's respectful, it's caring, it's inclusive, it's future focused, and challenges the norm. We're honoured to be amongst you. And whilst we've seen nothing as certain or to be taken for granted, the England team have just shown that diversity, tolerance and respect move mountains. And you're writing the blueprint for those mountains within Knowledge Quarter in this very, very special part of London. We can't wait to see what we get to develop with you and look forward to joining that journey and writing that future here together. Thank you for allowing me the last few minutes of this conference.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. And big thanks to you and to the team at Regent's Place, Rose Alexander, Paul Jaffe, but most of all to Kate Morell, who is my partner in crime at Regent's Place. And over the last 6 months, 8 months, we've been in daily contact, weekly contact about the conference. So big thanks to the whole team there. Thank you again. And finally, a massive thanks to all the speakers and to all the panelists and to all the keynotes and all the team behind the scenes at the Knowledge Quarter, Simon Kane and our Knowledge Quarter board, Milad Yusufi and the team at Hubilo, and everyone who's helped put this together in as smooth a way as possible. Not that easy, but I think we've done our best. Like I said, all the sessions will be up online next week, so please look forward to those and send us your comments and your feedback. I hope you have a wonderful evening and enjoy the rest of the week and the weekend. And we look forward to seeing you at a future Knowledge Quarter event and, of course, the 2022 Knowledge Quarter conference. All the best.